And that is my cue that it is now 5:30. So I'm going to call to order the Eugene Water and Electric Board December 7th, 2021 meeting. We'll start with an agenda check. Does anybody have anything to add or subtract from the agenda? And I'm embarrassed, but remind me how I get more people on my screen, because of the commissioners, I only see Sonia and Matt, and I don't see John Borofsky. Oh, now I got
just
it.
click on any of them.
Yeah, got it. Okay. So nobody shook their head yes. Nothing for agenda check, correct? Okay, then we'll move on to items from board members and general manager. Is there anybody that wants to go first? I'm just going to call on someone then. John Borofsky, anything from you?
No, I don't have anything to report this month as of now. Mackenzie Watershed Council will meet this week on Thursday. I'm going to do my best to attend that virtually, but other than that, nothing to report.
Commissioner Carlson?
I don't believe I have anything at this point either. Oh, actually, I did want to follow up. I hadn't heard anything about our, from last meeting, the titles coming up on the screen. And I was curious if I could get a follow-up on that, because now I don't see any of our names on the screen, whereas before I think we did have names. Yeah, that's all I have right now.
Commissioner Carlson, that was in the general manager's report that was sent out today. So there is a way that we can change that. So through email.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Thank you.
Commissioner McCray, anything from you?
Nothing from me, thanks.
And lastly, Commissioner Brown, anything from you?
Yeah, several things. OPEB board met earlier this quarter, and just to summarize the whole thing, it's as good at financial shape as it's ever been. It's really good. They're getting good returns, and the financial status of that fund is very good. Number two, I had a lady contact me. She's not in my ward, but I know her personally. A tree from our reservoir site fell and took out the fence, took out a shed, and we denied the claim. And this is the second time it's happened. And I got a learning process. I just like to let everybody else know, even though it came from our property and destroyed her property, we're not liable. And that's the way the law reads. And it wasn't a big claim. It was like $800. It was settled. The staff did what they could. They did really good. But I guess it goes both ways. And general manager told me that if a tree from her property falls and hits our reservoir, she's not liable. But that's a learning experience for me, because I would have thought that we would have taken care of that, but we don't. And it's a law. And then the last thing is, I know several of you and others have been asking me whether or not I'm going to run again. And I totally haven't made up my mind. I have picked up some papers and probably leaning towards it, but we'll see. I still have a little bit of time to make up my mind and go from there. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Great, thank you. The only thing that I have to add is that most of us, I think, if not all of us, took a tour of where we got to see the potential second water treatment plant site this past month. Although it's kind of hard to believe that that was just in the last month. It feels like ages ago, but that was another one of our field trips, and I really appreciate the field trips. I think that they're super helpful. And over to you, Frank.
Yes, President Schlossberg, Commissioners, good evening. Just one item from me. I just wanted to thank all of the volunteers who helped with the Run to Stay Warm, which I believe occurred between last meeting and this meeting. And some of you I know participated, and so wanted to. And as soon as we get final numbers as to the success of both the race and the participants and the fundraising piece of that, we will provide that feedback to the board. But I, in the meantime, wanted to thank all the volunteers who took their part of their weekend and more than part of their weekend to help with that. So thank you.
Thank you. That also seems like ages ago. And I guess I can just add to mine that I've never run a 5K before, but I set the EWEB Run to Stay Warm as my goal and I did it. So that felt really good. Okay, so now we are on to public input. We have 3 speakers signed up tonight. When your name is called, remember to unmute your call. Press *6 if you're calling from a landline, or simply use the unmute button if calling from your cell phone. Please state your name and optionally your address or ward and speak clearly into the phone. Each speaker will be offered 3 minutes to present their testimony. Please keep track of your time. You will hear an audio notification when 3 minutes has elapsed, and I will interrupt you to let you know as well. After all testimony is heard, each commissioner will have an opportunity to speak if they choose, although by policy, we do not engage in a back and forth dialogue. Please note that failure of a commissioner to speak shall not be construed as support of or opposition to any speaker's testimony. If a question is presented by a speaker and the board does not provide an answer, an EWEB staff member will contact the speaker so that the question can be addressed at a later time. So the public testimony period for this meeting is now open, and we are going to start off with Tim Carmichael, followed by Mark Rabinowitz. So Tim, are you on the line right now?
Hi there, it's Tom Carmichael.
Oh my gosh, so sorry.
No worries.
Okay.
So yeah, I just want, can I get started here? Or,
yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So yeah, I'm over on Hunsaker. So the reason I wanted to speak today was to talk about the second water treatment plant that's going to be sourcing water from the Willamette. I'm very, informed on the McKenzie water plant. I actually did a tour on that with my son several years ago. It's a great facility, great tasting water. Like, I think everything is fantastic. Can't say enough great things about it. This move to taking water in from the Willamette is something I'm really concerned about. I'm concerned about the fees, concerned about the water source itself. You got mercury coming in from Cottage Grove off the reservoirs. You've got countless fuel tanks and ag runoff that is, we're planning for this big shake that is going to happen someday. All that stuff coming down that river, it's just nasty stuff. I don't understand why we would invest in a second water plant pulling water off of that river. And I did speak with my representative about this at length. They talked about the water temperature being higher, and the goal being to restore some of that watershed up there with this water fee that now all the customers are paying. So I got concerns along those lines as well. It's like, it doesn't make sense to me that we're all paying this monthly water bill fee to restore properties up there, luxury real estate that most people in town cannot afford to purchase. So now we're all paying this fee, and that really bothers me. I didn't feel like we had any input on that, and we've got the auto bill pay with electronic communication. There's all kinds of polling that we could be doing off of this, and it really feels to me like the commission, with the best of intentions, has really lost touch with the ratepayers. And I wanted to reach out and say, please start being more proactive in reaching out to us and getting our opinions, especially on something this big. We all know that Seneca has proven to be an epic disaster on so many levels, from the cost to the secret contracts that ratepayers are paying. Like, there was so much scandal with the Seneca setup that we've got, and I just have this bad feeling that the Willamette water plant is going to end up being our second core investment with ratepayer funds. So that's what I wanted to speak to you guys about. The water quality on the Willamette it's not even on par with the McKenzie. I grew up playing on both of those rivers. The idea of drinking water out of the Willamette is just nasty. I'd probably end up thinking it well before I pull water out of that and think about drinking out of that river. And I have looked at all the stuff with the treatment, and I understand that there's things that they can do to pull that stuff out. The nice thing with McKenzie is you don't need to do that. It's a great clean river. It seems like that's something that we should invest more money into versus investing into this Willamette River watershed. So if you ask the people in Flint, Michigan, if they thought it was a good idea to, change their water source over to Flint River, they probably would have opted for that, but they did it anyways. And
Great.
saw how
Thank
that
you.
ended. So.
Yep. Your 3 minutes are up. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Next up, we have Mark Rabinowitz, followed by Sandra Bishop.
Good evening. Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. One thing about the watershed protection, it would be very helpful for EWEB to advocate for a ban on aerial spraying of poison over the watersheds, whether the Mackenzie or Coast Range or Middle Fork. It's decades overdue. It'd be nice also to see the massive clear-cutting logging that's changing our climate to be made illegal if we were really concerned about watersheds. A couple years ago, I went up one of the watersheds to a hearing of the Army Corps of Engineers, which had limited showings of their dam inundation maps. We were allowed to look at them, but not take them home or take a photo. I did look at a couple places where friends live to reassure or warn them about the potential dangers. Reason for mentioning this is looking at the photos of your cracked reservoirs on Hawkins Hill and College Hill. These are potential risks to downhill neighbors, and there need to be similar maps made public for people to know what to do in the case of an emergency. We have maps for tsunami inundation on the coast, and we should know what they are for people in Eugene. A different concern, there's been a lot of public discussion lately about electricity and natural gas, which has completely ignored the increase in generation in Oregon in the past decade has mostly come from increased use of natural gas. So it'd be nice for EWEB to help educate the public about the Western WECC grid that stretches from BC to Tijuana to Denver, what it takes to power it, the potentials for less hydropower as climate change intensifies, the need to use less electricity, not more, given the difficulties in sustaining generation. We are past peak electricity in the United States, which I hope EWEB is aware of, since you have to count the numbers. And maybe we could do things like require insulation of buildings, change the building code for passive solar design, bring back the solar access law in Eugene, which is gone, and other things to recognize we live on an abundant, finite planet that is not going to have endless growth forever. 2 decades ago, the geologist Colin Campbell, that Matt McRae may remember, predicted that a sign of peak energy would be wilder oscillations in energy pricing. COVID closures managed to reduce energy more than anything else ever has, but now that those are being dropped, we're seeing a difficulty in sustaining the demand that people have at the end of the pandemic. So
thank you, Mr.
Don't live on use less.
All right, thank you very much. Last up is Sandra Bishop on the line. I see that there's someone waiting in the lobby.
I've just admitted Miss Bishop. She should be on the line now.
Okay. Sandra Bishop, you are our final public input, public testimony person for this evening. Are you there?
Yes. It was
All
not
right.
an easy task to get into this meeting.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Okay, your time starts now.
Okay, thank you. My name is Sandra Bishop. My husband and I live at 40th and Hilliard, adjacent to the 40th and Patterson, what used to be a hill water reservoir project. And I was very hesitant to testify or speak tonight because I know the commissioners do not want to hear from ratepayers on this. They're all into policy, so I want to talk about the policy level. But first, I just want to preface it with saying that I want to commend the EWEB staff and contractors that are working on this project. They have been very good at working with us and the other neighbors when things come up. So I want to talk about policy tonight and just say the staff's doing a really good job here. As you know, last month, about this exact same time, our house was hit with a blast. That there was an error on the site when they did a blast and hit our house. The contractor's taking care of it. We have no problems with that. It's all going to be made right. What I do have a problem with and want to go on the public record and make sure this is in the permanent record to say that as EWEB commissioners, even though you want to stay at the policy level, you really need to come out on site and experience the actual impacts, ooh, bad pun, of this project. So please come and spend part of a day up here, watch one of the blasts, but don't just come for the blast party. Please stay and watch the operation of an open pit mine in the middle of the South Hills, because that's what's happening up here. And for the record, I want to say that EWEB does not have the authority to build 2 water reservoirs at this site at this time. The general manager has arbitrarily tripled the gallonage and doubled the size. So if you would have listened to neighbors, you would have been able to save a 150-year-old forest and build 1 reservoir up here, which is in all the metro plan and the underlying facilities documents. So if you're looking at policy, please do your job, and you should be dialing it back to fit those policies. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The public testimony period for this meeting is now closed, and at this time, commissioners are given the opportunity to comment if they choose. So I don't know if there, I see Commissioner Carlson. Go ahead.
Hi, so thank you all for your testimony. Tom, it was great talking to you. I think we spoke about the various projects and communication for about an hour. Really appreciated that that time that we had, and I did take away some other ideas. I do like the idea of having, when we have these major projects, really doing a bit more on the kind of the surveying of customers side. I think it was a good reminder for me. It is something we've, done in the past, and I think it's something we should probably do again, just to, get feedback from the general public, especially as, our meetings, I think, are somewhat more accessible and that you don't have to actually go to the EWEB headquarters to be there. But it's still a time where, everybody is busy and being on Zoom is challenging. So again, I really appreciate that time. I appreciate the phone call that we had. As far as the blast site, I did want to note that I did the week after they resumed the blasting on site at the 40th and Patterson, I went down and I did experience the blasting during one of the Tuesday events that they had. Great to have staff walk me through everything down there. They showed me, kind of the work and how they laid the mats out, the different safety measures that they've taken. I felt so comfortable with it, and actually there were many neighbors in the area that had come and witnessed it kind of regularly. I actually brought my son down a couple, I think last week, to see the site as well. So it is, I'm not going to downplay the fact. It's certainly an impact on the neighborhood. I did sit around and kind of watch as the trucks went in and out, and unfortunately the house, especially Sandra's home, is right there in the midst of it. I'm really sorry. My heart goes out to you. I do appreciate that staff and the contractors are taking care of the situation that happened last month, and I do support the fact that we were going to have to remove all those trees again. We were going to have to remove all those trees to build 2 tanks, whether or not we were going to build 2 tanks now, or if we were going to build 2 tanks in the future. So, for me, getting it out of the way and not having to impact the neighbors here and then again in the future, I thought was very important. And when I've talked to the people who came to visit the site, I got a lot of positive feedback on the process and the support from staff. So, I do hope that others get to go down. It seems like the blasting is happening on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and if you haven't had the opportunity to go down, I would definitely recommend it. It's very interesting to see it happen firsthand. So thanks again to Laura and the team.
Thank you, Sonia. Is there anybody, John Borofsky or Matt McCrae? Either one of you want to jump in? Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you all three for taking the time to provide testimony tonight. I do wonder, my guess is we've done some surveys of customers about a second source, and Frank, if we've done that, I'd be interested in seeing whatever work we might have done to gauge people's concern about a second source. I hear the concern raised about the water quality of the two rivers, but knowing that we need a second source, it feels like it doesn't feel like we have that many options. But anyway, Frank, if there's any survey work that's been done, I'd be interested in taking a look at that. I do plan to take a visit to the water reservoir project up on 40th. I appreciate the encouragement to do so, Sandra, and I have heard from others that it's worth taking a look. So I will make sure to get up there and see that in the near future. And then lastly, Ms. Bishop said that we're not authorized to build 2 tanks, and forgive me if there was communication on that front and I missed it, but could you fill me in, Frank, if there's something there that we need to be aware of and I missed? And that's all. Thank you very much.
All right, Commissioner Brown, anything you would like to say?
Well, nothing directly, thank you. I just would like to thank all three for testifying, and I've taken what they've presented, and we'll consider each topic as it relates to the EWEB operations and my participation as a board member. Thank you.
And the only thing I'd like to add is also to thank everybody for testifying. I'm sorry, Sandra, that it was hard to get into this meeting. I know that's even though we've been doing this for almost 2 years now, technology sometimes can still be pretty glitchy and can be frustrating. And also, I would love the opportunity to go, if it's still possible, to one of the blasting days, or just to periodically go and visit the site again and see it through its different iterations in construction. I think that's a great idea. All right. So it looks like we are moving right along to our board action items. Agenda item number 4, which is approval of consent calendar A.
I move to approve consent
Second.
calendar.
All right, I heard a second from Sonia. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Okay.
Aye.
Great, consent calendar A is approved. And now we move on to item number 5, which is approval of consent calendar B.
Move to approve?
I'll second that.
All right. All those in favor of a consent calendar B, say aye.
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 That was also unanimously approved. Great. Okay, and we're on to agenda item number 7, which is the 2022 proposed budgets and prices. And I believe we have Deborah Hart and Adam Rue.
Good evening, commissioners. I am, for the record, Deborah Hart. With me this evening is Adam Rue, the Fiscal Services Supervisor. Also on the line and available for questions are Alicia Voorhees and Ben Sachdeva, their senior analysts who worked on this budget and the accompanying price proposals. Slide, please. This evening, we are again going to review the 2022 proposed budgets, as well as the update to electric and water prices, after which comes the final public hearing for the 2022 rates process. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Adam.
Thanks, Deborah. Next slide, please. So we've seen this chart the last couple months. This is the high-level summary of the budget.
and the more detailed document was provided in the backgrounder. This is also consistent with the plans that we put together and presented to the board in July as part of the financial plans. So we've seen these numbers throughout the year. We'll be happy to address any comments related to the combined budgets, but for both water and electric utilities, the combined budget is just under $390 million. Next slide, please. So after 5 years of no overall price increases for both utilities, we are seeing a shortfall in the revenue requirement. Both utilities are entering a period of significant capital investment for replacing aging infrastructure and upgrading systems. So in addition to this being the first year of overall revenue requirement increase in some time, it's also the first year we're implementing the cost of service results. So this will have different impacts to the different customer classes, and we'll see those on the next couple slides. Finally, we're also proposing the annual update to the market-based pricing for the electric utility and the wholesale water contract pricing. So next slide, please. So with the price proposals, we did see different impacts for different customer classes. This is a function of the cost of service analysis that we put together. We tried to mitigate some of the impacts to some extent by looking at the 3-year trend and presented the results of that 3-year cost of service. So absent any significant changes over the next couple of years, we'd expect the 2023 and 2024 to be consistent with these results. But today we're only looking for approval for the 2022 pricing. The overall price increases are being applied equally to all the different billing determinants, so both the basic and the volume charge. But next year, the board will be looking more closely at rate design, so the impact of the different fixed versus variable charge and different rate design structures. The next slide, please. So the water cost of service also had different impacts for the different customer classes. When we refer to the smoothing or gradualism, we're really referring to the cost of service results. So the overall increases for those years are a function of the revenue requirement for each of those years. So for 2023 and 2024, those higher increases are largely related to the second source treatment plant. And so any changes to the timing or funding sources of that significant investment may impact proposals in those years. But at this point, this is the projections for the next couple of years rate trajectory. There is no pre-funding for the second source treatment plant included in the 2022. So this represents the normal capital expenditure for 2022. Next slide, please. So the impact to both EWEB of EWEB bills, both relative to median household income and comparator utilities, is an important factor to demonstrate affordability. This chart shows a typical water and electric customer for a single family, all electric heated household. And it shows us maintaining our position among our comparators, though that does reflect the rate increases. This shows our current and proposed changes in prices, but only looks at the current prices for our comparator utilities. So any pending price changes are not reflected in there, but this shows our current and proposed. So with that, I'll turn it back to Deborah.
Thank you, Adam. This evening, management is recommending approval of the 2022 budgets and water and electric prices as presented in your board backgrounder and the materials that Adam went over this evening. Our next step from here is a public hearing, and then we'll be back to answer any questions and seek your approval. Thank you. Slide.
I have a process question. I know I have to open the public hearing. Is there a preamble that I'm supposed to read for the public hearing?
President Schlossberg, I would say it's the same as the original one.
Okay. So I should just read that again, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Okay. Well, I think we only have one person signed up for this public, for the public meeting. But you will have 3 minutes to present your testimony. You can state your name, optionally your address or ward, and we will let you know when your 3 minutes is up. So I will, the public testimony for the public hearing period is now open. And we have Sandra Bishop signed up. Sandra, are you still on the line? Doesn't sound like she's on the line. And did we have anybody else who signed up later for the public hearing on budgets?
President Schlossberg, Ms. Bishop was the only person signed up for the public hearing, and I do not see her phone number any longer in the participant names or numbers.
All right.
The scheduled time for the public, oh, I think she may have just chimed in.
Okay.
Yes, I'll admit her now.
Okay.
Immaculate timing.
I'm here.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. We're running ahead, but you are the only person who signed up for the public hearing on budgets. So your 3 minutes is about to start now.
Okay, thank you. Sandra Bishop, 4096 Hilliard. And I want to say, as a former commissioner, it's not easy understanding, reading these budgets. One thing that I noticed, I've been trying to read some of this the budgetary documents for about 6 months. And I spent about, I don't know, 5 hours one day trying to find any reference to rate increases. And then I finally realized that the term rate is not usually used anymore. And I would strongly urge you to ask your financial people to please revert back to using plain English and the kind of, somebody called it Orwellian terminology of things like customer requirements. The customer owners of EWEB have a requirement for power and water. And when they pay for that, it is a rate. It's not a customer requirement. Drives people crazy to not be able to just read documents and find the plain English, plain words. So please think about that. Think about how you could make it a little more understandable for people. The other thing I wanted to point out, I know that the commissioners want to stay at the policy level. They don't want to deal with operations in any way. But part of the policy responsibility of an EWEB commissioner is to understand budgets and to track where the money is going. And I noticed in a consent calendar item, it was in the, I think it was the consent calendar A on November 2nd, and it was under contracts item number 9. There was an $830,000 additional cost being put forward to go with a Murray Smith Associates contract for the 40th and Patterson water reservoir site. Their original contract was for $400,000. They then asked for an additional $830,000, which was over a 200% increase in that item. And it brought the total up to 1.2 or 1,230,000. And not a single commissioner questioned it or thought it was something to be noted. So I would really appreciate knowing that someone I'm sure you can assign a staff person to do this, but someone is actually tracking and going to give reports back to you as commissioners of what the cost overruns are on this project, because that's quite a substantial cost. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, so the public testimony period for this hearing is now closed. And Deborah, do we want to, I guess I'll hand it back to you for questions.
And I guess I'll hand it back to you for questions. So we're here to answer any questions that you have, and then after that, seek approval on the resolutions that are outlined here.
All right, so if you want to raise your hand, I can to jump in the queue for questions. Commissioner McCray?
Yeah, if I may, I just want to make a comment in response to Ms. Bishop's comments. I believe, I'll speak for myself, I do look through those contract items and the changes in prices because I think it's important, and I actually really appreciate how carefully those are documented by staff, and I feel like there are cost overruns on many things, but I feel like our staff are really plain about it and transparent about it, and it makes me more comfortable as somebody who's providing some level of oversight on budgeting. There are absolutely places where we have costs that we weren't expecting, and it's in all kinds of places, right? Not just this project or that contractor. Anyway, I appreciate the transparency and the documentation that were provided that makes it easy for us to see what's going on. I'll also point out to Ms. Bishop, you may be aware already, there was an opportunity for staff or for board members to ask staff about specific items in advance of the meeting, and sometimes the questions about those items will be resolved through a publicly published email exchange between staff and board members. So it may not be visible in the middle of a meeting, but it is in the public record oftentimes. That's all I have to say. Thank you for putting together these materials for us to review. It's dense, but I really appreciate the work that goes into making this digestible for us. So thank you, staff.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, Frank, you want to jump in?
Yes, President Schlossberg, thanks to Commissioner McCray for pointing out a couple of things. I would say that, in Ms. Bishop's defense, there have been a couple of changes in protocol over the last several years. The publishing of the Q&A is something that did not occur previously. The links to the questions and answers are on the website under the agenda items, so those are accessible to the public. And like Commissioner McCray pointed out, there's a lot of back and forth when there are questions on items like consent calendar items or really any agenda item. I would also point out that we also, one of the things that we have started to do in the last several years is to publish a quarterly report, which highlights by major project where we are from a budgeting perspective. And so that can be a little bit confusing, because if you look at sometimes things item by item, you want to get a little bit more of a broader picture of the entire project. And so the quarterly financials, we track the capital projects in the quarterly report as well. And so there is, I would consider quite a bit of visibility to the board around the major financial issues and questions that come up. So I appreciate Commissioner McCray pointing that out.
Commissioner Carlson.
I wanted to add on too that the format for each of the calendar consent items has changed from when I started on the board a number of years ago, in part because of a lot of the questions that we frequently ask as board members. You know, when you're looking at a major item for approval, you want to know how much of the budget it is. Have we worked with this contractor before? have we had any cost overruns? Why, did we have enough bidders on it? If we didn't have enough bidders, what was the reasoning? Do we feel like this is actually a competitive rate? Those were all the kinds of questions that I was frequently asking in those pre-meeting questions. And staff, in response to that, said, you know what? We're going to put a template together that just puts all of that information up front into the board document. So even a lot of my pre-meeting questions have dropped off because those kinds of things are readily available in the board document to see before we even need to look at it. And I really appreciate staff's response to that. I think it's more transparent to the public. I think it makes our meetings run more efficiently. And if there are other questions, we give them time to really dig into those really meaty questions ahead of time. So, I do take a little bit of an issue when you say that we're not involved in the policy, or we only want to be on the policy side. I'd be happy to talk with you directly if you want to know my stance on how I operate with the board and the kind of things that I care about. Because I'll sit down with a constituent for an hour here and there as needed, because I think that's the work that needs to be done when you represent a board. And digging into these documents is something I think each and every one of us takes very seriously. So, we may not have that conversation here, but that information is documented. And I hope that you do understand that each and every one of us cares very much about the work that goes into this. And staff takes great pride in what they do. I mean, you can tell this is a 400-page document. So, I don't have any questions currently on the budget because I know we've hashed a lot of this out over the last few months, and a lot of my questions have already been answered through that process. So I am going to support the work that's done here today, and I don't take it lightly because this will be only the second time in 5 years that I've ever voted on a rate increase, when in the past I've actually voted on a rate decrease. So, this is a big step for us, and it's a big step for me, and it's not something that I take lightly, but I do appreciate the work that staff have done, especially over the last number of years, to make sure that we are being efficient and we're respectfully using the ratepayers' dollars, because this is a big change, and it is something that we've held off for what, 5 out of the last 6 years, at least that. So, thank you to staff for all of your work on this. I appreciate it, and I'll turn it back over.
Thank you, Sonia. John Borowski.
Thank you. So I do have a couple of questions and a comment. One of the questions would be to Deborah. Well, first off, I want to state that I want to thank Deborah and Adam for being able to sit down with me before last month's meeting, and actually we had about an hour and a half dig into this proposed budget, and I got a lot of the questions that I had about it answered at that point. My first question is a process question, because this will be the first budget that I voted on as a commissioner, and so I'm just curious as to overall, not in particular this budget, but any budget as it goes. Is there a statutory time frame that we need to vote on this? And the reason I'm asking that is, let's say, we had one person giving public testimony, but let's say that this was a contentious budget and there were 25 people that commented on it, and we may have wanted to amend this budget. Is there a statutory time frame that this budget needs to be enacted by?
That's a good question, and yes, it is the end of this calendar year, so 12/31.
Okay, so in the future, if something like that happened, we could maybe, and the commission felt that it needed more time to digest it, there, you've left yourself time to do maybe a second meeting if it was needed.
Looks like Frank.
So yes, this is Frank Lawson. Commissioner Borowski, there are a couple of options. One of them is part of the reason that we have 2 public hearings, one in November and one in December. So I would point out that it starts actually in November, and if it was very contentious, we would hope, and we advertise for both of those. If we did have to go to a special session for some reason, we would need to do that sometime between now and the end of the year, and that is an option that is available to the board if needed.
Okay, thank you.
I just
go ahead, Deborah.
I just wanted to also add that it's really important to staff that they make sure that they highlight for you all. So if there is any change between November and December, that's highlighted. And if there are significant changes since July when we first started talking about it. So we do try and surface that as well if we find something that needs to be changed. So to give more of a heads up even.
Great. And the reason I say that is just in all my years of giving testimony and doing this, you know, a public hearing, if I hear something from the public, I want to make sure that there's an opportunity to implement what I hear from the public. And so that's why I was asking the process question on this first one. The second comment I want to make about this budget, and this was made clear to me in the meetings that I had with Adam and Deborah, is I'm concerned about the sharp increases in the water in the out years, especially 22, 23. And what I hope is that we can look at that next spring when it comes out, because the higher rate increases are in the early years of the 10-year financial plan. And if we could do a little bit more smoothing on that, I would like to at least dig into that at the appropriate time next spring and see if that's an option moving forward. And then lastly, kind of like what Sonia said, I agree with this budget. I will be voting to approve this budget, but it's not taken lightly that we're increasing rates by 3.7%. In these times, everything is going up. Our costs are going up, our wholesale prices are going up, our cost of doing business is going up. And I think we're seeing that around the board, but it doesn't go past me the impact that this will have on our citizens and our ratepayers. And so we do take this very seriously. We want to, or at least speaking for myself, I want to minimize as much as possible the rate impact on our customers, but yet also be able to provide the product that they count on us for. And so with that, I will be voting for the 3.7% increase. I wish it could have been less, but I agree with where we're going, and just know that we do take, anytime we have to increase the cost to our customers, we take that with a lot of heavy hearts. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Brown?
Yeah, I think a lot of good things have been said. I too am going to support this budget, but I provide caution to everybody about we don't have anything in there on the outlying years for LEBERG, and that's the one that has, in my last 15 or 14 years on this board, concerns me the most. And that's something that we're facing that's going to be substantial, and we're not going to get away from. And I think it's revenue negative. It's not, it's not going to generate any revenue when we spend whatever amount of money we do spend. And so I just want to keep that at the forefront of everybody's minds when we're making these rate increases, that in the future, and correct me, Deborah and Adam, if I'm wrong, but I don't think there's anything in those projections for the next couple of years of for dealing with the LEBERG situation. Thank you.
All right. I guess I'm last up. And just a couple things from me. I appreciate how thorough staff has been over these past several months, where we've really dived into the budget. And so a lot of our questions have already been answered. Piggybacking on Commissioner Brown's comment about LEBERG, I'm just curious if perhaps in a future memo or something to the board, you can you could just kind of inform us a little bit about when we make big changes like that have huge impacts, financial impacts on our budget. How do you plan for that? It's not really a question I'm looking to be answered now, but I just have never done anything like that before, and I'm curious financially how an organization like this plans for kind of an uncertain path to follow. So that was one thing. And then the second thing, this isn't really part of the budget per se, but I do know that for some people, this rate increase will have an impact on them. And I know that we already have money set aside for assistance for people. There's many avenues for that. But I'm just wondering if you can maybe keep the board apprised in the first couple months of the year when people tend to take advantage of that assistance, just how that's going, and if we're getting more people requesting funds than have in the past, or if we're getting bigger requests, just so we can keep track of what are the effects on our limited income customers, just so we can know that. And yes, go ahead, Frank.
Yes, President Schlossberg. We will make note certainly that things like the customer care program and the rate, the burn rate on that, I'll use that expression, will be included in the quarterly metrics that we provide. You know, a bulk of that, and it is shaped for the times of most need, which tend to be in the winter months and the early spring months. And so we do a certain degree of shaping with that, and it's targeted to help a certain percentage of customers pay a certain percentage of their bills. And so we will report back regularly on that. And the contingency planning that you talk about is part of our long-term financial plan process. It's part of the reason that we look at 10 years. I was going to ask Deborah, I believe there was some placeholder in there for Leberg in its sort of immediacy. It is not the long-term decommissioning numbers, for example, if that was on the table. But I believe that, and I'll leave her to actually confirm the number, but there was, Deborah, you can maybe elaborate on that piece, but we can talk about the contingency planning more as we go, President Schlossberg.
Thank you, Frank. Yes, sorry, I wasn't fast enough with my numbers and on the unmute. We do have 20 million, acknowledging though, as Frank had said, that's not if decommissioning were out the full amount, but there is something in there to address more immediate needs.
Great, thank you. So do we need to vote? Is that how it goes?
Yes, please.
I think we have to do each of them separately. Is that right?
I think so, yes.
All right, move to approve resolution number 21118, 2022 budgets.
Second.
Great. All those in favor, say aye.
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 All right, resolution 2118 was unanimously approved. Moving on to resolution 2119, the electric prices.
Move to approve.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 And lastly, moving on to resolution number 2120, water prices.
Move to approve.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 It was also unanimously approved. All right. I believe
Thank you very much, commissioners. I just wanted to say thank you to you all. I know that you've been digging into these numbers since this process started, which is the process, and look forward to it again starting in about May. And so you don't get a very many months off before we start digging into the next one. But appreciate all of your time, and then appreciate Deborah and Adam and Alicia and Ben in particular for pulling all this together. So thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Okay. We are now on agenda item number 10, the 2022 state legislative agenda. So Jason Huser is up.
Good evening, commissioners. Good to see you all again. The 2022 session, I'm expecting a light legislative agenda, not only for EWEB, but also for the legislature. I think you probably all have gathered from the newspapers that the last two legislative sessions have had their share of friction and lack of alignment, and I think as a result, the legislature is going into 2022 with a pretty small agenda. That's probably a relief to me, because I'm right now, this very moment, I think I'm tracking and participating in at least 6 or 7 different rulemakings for legislation from 2021. So I appreciate the breather. Also, I think the one topic that might have been considered in 2022, eviction protections, that probably will get handled in a special session later this month. So given the light policy agenda, EWEB will be focusing instead on potential funding opportunities that match EWEB infrastructure needs. There's a couple of different funding sources we'll be looking at. One would be the redeployment of unspent Federal American Rescue Plan Act dollars, ARPA, that were allocated to Oregon last year. Additionally, we'll be taking a look at any funds that may be coming from the recently passed Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act in Congress, the IIJA. And finally, there's always the possibility that there may be some state general funds available. The state revenue picture looks pretty good right now. It's not 100% clear that our efforts on funding will be totally ripe. For example, ARPA and IIJA, those may be decisions that might need to be made later this year after the legislative session. I'm not sure if it's well known to you all, but there is a state emergency board, which is a legislative committee that has special authorities to spend money and allocate resources at any time of the year, even when the legislature is not in session. Some of those decisions may end up falling to the emergency board, or potentially even some future special session in 2022. I wanted to talk a little bit about the different revenue sources I just mentioned to you. First, I did mention ARPA. ARPA was a true stimulus bill for Congress. A stimulus bill by nature is meant to be awarded quickly. It's a sprint to jumpstart the economy. And as a result, from moving so quickly, there's knowledge that some ARPA projects may not ever be completed. Either they turn out not to be consistent with US Treasury guidance, or there's other reasons the project proves not to be feasible. Those unspent funds could be redeployed in the future. Just wanted to note that water infrastructure is one of the approved uses of ARPA dollars, not electric. Again, there's a ripeness question here. I don't know how soon we would know of projects that are not going to prove feasible, but it's always better to be ready and be early rather than be late to the game. So we'll be seeing if there's any ARPA dollars that line up with EWEB infrastructure projects. Moving forward to the IIJA, the infrastructure bill. In contrast to ARPA, the stimulus bill, the IIJA is a true generational infrastructure bill, which means it's a multiple year investment over a 6 or 7 year period. It's more of a long distance race. The project, I guess you could say, instead of shovel ready, it'll be focusing on shovel worthy projects. And it uses existing federal and state programs wherever possible, but there's some instances where IIJA will require new federal programs to be stood up through federal rulemaking and staffing exercises, which probably will take several months to do that. That means there might be some early bird IIJA money that gets on the streets maybe as early as Q2 or Q3 of 2022, but more likely the bulk of funds will start becoming available for allocation by closer to the end of 2022. Some funds will fund it directly from the federal government agencies to recipients. In other instances, IIJA will use state agencies as sub-grantees. For example, I know the grid hardening dollars. There will be an allocation that the federal agencies make directly to recipients, and there will be a separate pot of money specifically for states. And I think also that's notable because although states typically receive these IIGA funds by a formula, I think there will be a special supplement that will be made available to Western states due to the regional nature of heavy wildfire risk in the West. We don't totally know what the state legislative role will be on IIGA. It's possible that the state agencies will ultimately make a lot of the decisions, but we know there will be some oversight role for the legislature. Just off the top of my head, I know that there are expenditure limitations, which are essentially permission to spend money that will need to be adjusted for state budgets for each of the agencies, and that's something that's approved by the legislature, any additional federal funds that are spent by those agencies. As for EWEB's process, our analysis is still ongoing. We're still learning. It's a very, very long bill and not easy to get your arms around. A couple of highlights to share with you this evening are the following. There is dedicated funding to electric system hardening and undergrounding. There's funding for drinking water infrastructure. We're still determining how much of that is in the form of loan versus grant, and to what extent eligibility criteria for grants might be relaxed in the future that would make more communities eligible for grant as opposed to traditional financing. There's also funding for transmission upgrades. I don't know that EWEB will directly avail ourselves to that, but a more modernized and interconnected regional grid will certainly have an indirect benefit to EWEB. There's going to be funding available for EV charging grants. The emphasis will be on highways and transportation corridors, but there certainly will be some funds available within cities for charging at workplaces. And there's also a great amount of money for ecosystem restoration. I don't know that EWEB would be a recipient of that, or even private entities. Most of that funding most likely will go to ecosystem restoration on federal or state lands, but there could be a lot of upside for water source protection, and I'm sure Carl will be excited to dig into the details with me on that. And finally, I did want to note there were provisions in the IIGA that could be quite helpful to future renegotiation of a more equitable Columbia River Treaty with Canada that would be good for Northwest ratepayers, including EWEB customers. And finally, the Bonneville Power Administration did get expanded borrowing authority through the infrastructure bill, so that's regionally noteworthy. Finally, the third category of funds, just general funds from the state budget or lottery dollars. Those are totally fungible. They can be used for any purpose. They're also the most highly competitive dollars, so the chance of success could be lower for general fund dollars going towards EWEB projects, but I certainly included on the list here. As far as the EWEB process on identifying projects, it would go like this. Staff have been, in one instance, I know I read the bill. I'm still digesting parts of it and went through a lot of black tea in doing so. It's been more helpful to use the many executive summaries that are out there from various trade associations that EWEB is a member of. Many of those associations also, they have national headquarters in Washington, D.C., and of course staff there, and they have been preparing and making available webinars for electric and water utilities. I was just on one this morning with the Northwest Public Power Association. I'm going to be on another one tomorrow with Van Ness Feldman, a federal lobbying firm. So we're getting our radar up, we're doing our homework, and there are EWEB staff meetings this month with a combination of water, electric, and finance staff. We'll be going through a process where we match EWEB projects that we see being aligned with specific funding opportunity goals. We'll be developing project narratives that are engaging, gathering any data that would support measurable outcomes of EWEB projects, building relationships with state and federal program managers. Some of these programs are going to be unique in that they're not necessarily traditional grant programs where you have no contact with the people making the decisions. They're going to be programs where you're going to have an opportunity to advocate for your project and speak directly with the people making decisions about project awards. And finally, we'll be identifying and contacting any supportive community partners that can help support our effort to find some of these federal funds and bring them towards local projects that will benefit our community and EWEB ratepayers. So that's the lay of the land, and I'd be happy to take any questions. And after that, we'll have a resolution that we'll adopt that upholds our traditional EWEB principles for each legislative session.
Thank you, Jason. Sonia.
I just wanted to thank Jason back in November, right around the same time when we had the tour and the race to stay warm, right smack dab in the middle of that. I think there were a couple of, I think Mindy and John Brown and Frank were all out. And so I was offered the opportunity to go and speak on EWEB's behalf with Senator Wyden and Congressman DeFazio. And I really appreciated Jason's help with talking points and, you know, getting up to speed there and making sure that hit all the points. So thank you for that. That was around the Infrastructure and Investment Jobs Act, and it was really interesting to find out, you know, a bit more about that work and how it pertains to EWEB and what we're going to be able to do, you know, with that. So I'm very supportive of, you know, the agenda that Jason has outlined, and I appreciate the work that you do every day to make sure that the rules are made correctly and that that we get the information that we need. And I do hope that this upcoming legislative session is a more calm one. I think we all need that. Thanks.
Thank you. John Borowski or Matt? Matt. I saw your hand up. So we'll go Matt, then John Borowski, then John Brown.
Great. Thanks, Mindy. Jason, would you be willing to send us your favorite executive summary of the IIJA? You said there are several of them. If there's one you feel like is.
I do have a new one that this came out. I have been going off of Senator Maria Cantwell from Washington. Her and her staff put together the best one I saw right out the gate. But I saw a really good one from the Northwest Public Power Association, and I'd be happy to supply that to the general manager to disseminate to you all.
That'd be great. Thank you very much. My other question is, have we hired, or given that this, as you said, is a generational investment, and this is something like this coming along every 20 or 30 years, we don't want to miss any of the opportunity here. Have we hired, or do we plan to hire additional staff to apply for and manage these, the funds that are headed our direction?
I can't answer that, but I know Frank's here. Do you want to tackle that, Frank? If not, I think I know the answer.
Well, I know the answer too, but I know Deborah just popped on because she is the one who's actually doing it. So Commissioner McCray, very great question. And Deborah, take it away.
So after all of that, yes, we did hire, we hired a grant specialist, and she started, I'm going to say, a month ago. She's making connections around the utility within the community, and I believe that Jason referenced a working group that is collaborating to make sure that we're ready to pursue any and all opportunities that look promising for us.
Great, thanks. And we have enough bandwidth in our finance team to manage all the dollars. Thank you. Good to hear. I'm glad we're ready for it.
Yeah,
and thanks for your work, Jason.
Thank you all. Thank you all for the support. And I will just add that I do know that I think our first internal staff meeting to go over the bill is Friday, and we're certainly going to be talking about workload and how do we make sure we have an ongoing process to make this smooth and that we're turning over every rock possible and then all the work gets done in an orderly way. So we'll be talking not only about the bill and what's in it, but how we're going to plan to do our work to respond as effectively as possible. And I've met our new grant writing staff person, Tegan DeBolt, and look forward to collaborating with her. I think my work and her work will be very complementary of each other. And obviously there's many other hands that are going to be involved in this. And I'm sorry, I don't know if there's another opportunity for me to say this. I just wanted to again thank Commissioner Carlson for appearing at the event with Congressman DeFazio and Senator Wyden to celebrate the infrastructure bill and its passage. It's a historic achievement, and it would not have been possible without Congressman DeFazio. He has been a tireless champion for infrastructure spending. I remember him talking about how overdue we were for infrastructure investment this is back in the early 2000s. I mean, it was a long time coming, but he got it across the finish line. And we're going to miss him when that day comes. And I think it would be fantastic if the board would consider sending a letter of congratulations and gratitude for this historic achievement to Congressman DeFazio. And I'd be happy to volunteer to prepare a first draft.
Great idea.
Agreed.
Yeah. Okay, John Borofsky.
Thanks for the update, Jason. A couple of questions. I'm on board with everything that you said as far as looking at funding. One of my questions is, though, have we also approached the local government agencies in regard to ARPA? You know, the county got a fair amount of money. The city got a fair amount of money. I know it's small in comparison to what was allocated to the state. However, I know that the city is spending $17 million this year, or not spending it, but received $17 million this year, and we'll get another $17 million next year. The county got more than that. And I would like to be able to know that we're going to them and letting them know that EWEB does have needs that may fit their goals as well. You know, I'm thinking specifically, we just voted for a rate increase, you know, so maybe we could approach the city and say, is some of your funding that you're not using eligible to help with low income rate assistance, those types of things, more at the local level. So I don't want those buckets to be overlooked just because we're looking at the state and the federal budget buckets.
Commissioner, it's a great question, and we have actually talked to the city at least once before, very recently, about this exact thing. And I know that we're going to be getting together with city staff again soon to update them on some of the projects that we would have available that would be ARPA compliant, and we will absolutely put our stuff on the table for their consideration.
Great. And with that in mind, you know, you talked about infrastructure hardening, and I know a project that Commissioner DeFazio or Congressman DeFazio championed and got in as a line item was the redesign of Franklin Boulevard. You know, as somebody who's been following that project for about the last 15 years, I know that overhead utilities in that sector are something that are problematic for our pedestrian and bicycle type of infrastructure. So if that could be thrown out there as well, as you know, make sure when you're designing this that you bring us to the fold and see if some of this money for hardening could be implemented, that would be wonderful. Again, working with all partners is something that I encourage all along. But thank you, and I will be voting to give you the thumbs up.
Thank you. John Brown.
Yeah, Jason, thanks again for another great report and your support for EWEB over the years and things such as that. I kind of want to follow on what John Borofsky said about having our partners deal with some things. As you know, when we raise rates, it's a financial windfall for the city because they get a percentage of what utility rates are, and the fact that we're paying twice as much as the intended legislation was intended for. I mean, the original ordinance was 3%, and we're paying 6%. And they're going to get a lot more money because of, you look at the rate trajectories we're going. And I would hope that we could encourage them to leverage that money in some of the achieving some of their climate recovery goals and things such as that, because right now I think it's just used for general fund. So hopefully we can have that conversation as well.
I want to echo that. I feel like I've sat in on so many of these leadership meetings with the city, and one of the things that comes up often about climate action plan is just there's not the budget for a lot of these projects, or we talk about potential projects that we could do with the city, and the funding is always an issue. So I know this isn't like the big legislative agenda, but I do see an opportunity, especially once we do raise rates and more of that revenue goes to the city, that maybe we push a little bit more for some of the things that perhaps they're putting on our laps to do that we do jointly, and some of the funding for it comes from that increased rate, the increased revenue that they get from our rate increase. Otherwise, I think the legislative agenda looks great.
Well, thank you all for the input, commissioners, and I certainly pledge to work with the general manager and my EWEB colleagues to take that to the city and find out what we can do cooperatively.
Okay, so I think maybe we're looking for a motion for resolution number 2117, the 2022 state legislative agenda.
Move to approve.
Second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 That was unanimously approved. I hope that it is a calmer year for you, Jason.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jason.
Yeah, thanks for all your hard work. All right, a question. We are now at our break time, but we are running pretty early, and I'm wondering if people want to go to our next agenda item, which is the climate change policy. It's about 30 minutes. Do you want to just continue and then take our break afterwards, or do you want to take our 5-minute break now? I guess raise your hand if you want to take our break now. Okay, then we will take our 5-minute break now, and we'll just say that we will, let's give us a little longer than that. You can give us a little longer, I think, Anne, if it's okay. Yeah, that's good. Okay, we'll see you all back shortly. like everyone's going to wait till the last 10 seconds to come back.
The countdown begins.
Good stuff.
All right, are we all back? I think we are. Okay, we are now on agenda item number 12, board policy, our climate change policy. And so Frank, that is you.
Great, thank you, President Schlossberg. Again, good evening, commissioners. For the audio record, this is Frank Lawson, General Manager. Go ahead with the next slide, please. This is a follow-up meeting from an initial discussion that we all had last month regarding potential changes that the board wished to review regarding board policy SD15, which is EWEB's climate change policy. And you did receive a backgrounder with a number of pieces of information in it, as well as some proposed changes to the policy based on the discussion last month. But I'd like to go through some of those at this point, just as a review with the board. Next slide, please. Just as a quick reminder, this policy, which originates back in 2007, this is really the first major upgrade and revision to the policy. There are a number of places where this policy ties to our strategic plan, both in the immediate sort of phases that we're in now, as well as setting really the objective targets to maintain this is one of our core values going forward. And so it does tie to the strategic plan in a number of areas, as well as operations. Go ahead with the next slide. Based on the conversation last month, there were a few takeaways that I wanted to reiterate with the board, at least my interpretation of what some of those takeaways were. From a primary directive standpoint, and the primary directives had to do with the sort of major focus areas of the policy, having to do, for example, with power generation, EWEB's own operations, for example, how we help customers to decarbonize. There were 5 different areas, and I'll get to those more specifically in the next slide. But there was general alignment across the members of the board that they felt pretty comfortable with the categories of which those primary directives fell. I think from the actual statement of metrics or goals, there was some differences of opinion with the board as to what level of precision to include in the policy versus other places. I tried to navigate through that in the proposals that were included this month to set some broad targets going forward, but also to recognize that some of the details fall out in how those get implemented. And within the primary directives, I tried to provide those linkages as to where those can be more precise as well. One of the other things that was mentioned was that location should be a consideration when looking at the future of our generating resources specifically. This I didn't include specifically in the policy language. I do believe it's a consideration that would be one of the sort of tangible areas of evaluation when we're looking at the design or the ultimate criteria inside of the integrated resource plan. So you won't see that one specifically called out for in SD15, although it will be an important thing to be included in the integrated resource plan itself. The last one, which was included in really the implementation language of the revision, had to do with equity. Equity is something that the board actually does not have a separate policy on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Typically, I might want to refer something specific like a climate change policy to a general equity policy. Since we don't have that, it's referred to just generically And I do believe that when we tee up the board policy review in general next month in January, that if the board doesn't recommend it, I think management will recommend that we look at developing a board level diversity, equity, and inclusion policy. And so that's not necessarily directly included in SD 15 other than an implementation reference. Go ahead with the next slide, please. So looking at some of the revisions that were included in the proposed language to the board under the power generation category, we tried to provide really two things. One was to set a target for kind of where we are now and where we're going relative to I won't call it a carbon intensity directly, but the amount of resource used that's carbon free. You right now believing that we're around 90%. That does change year by year. So the language that we put in the SD 15 policy language is rather important to us from a how you decide how to measure that. But also added the link in there that a number of things, such as your targets around certain resources, your measurables, your milestones, as well as your ability to set limits on customer impacts, which you might call your off ramps or your criteria around achieving. What are the limits to achieving going from 90 to 95%, for example. Much of that would be set within the design criteria that you call out in the integrated resource plan. So I tried to make that a little stronger linkage in the language, as well as provide a target to shoot for over the next 10 years, which is probably pretty significant given we have a number of resource decisions to make in that period. Several of the other categories I tried to link in where some of the measures came from, as well as where some of the implementation sort of comes in and out. For example, looking at the fact that you just had a discussion with Jason around setting the agenda for next year relative to measures, and in many cases in past years those have been related to climate change, and so I wanted to make sure that we had some of these areas that of implementation called out. Operations is an area where I tried to codify the work that was done basically a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, relative to reduction of emissions from our own operations, which was set at 25% by 2020. And those are below 2009 levels, and then 50% by 2030. You'll notice also in the correspondence items that came with the board packet that we're presently at 37% below 2009 levels in our carbon emissions reporting, which is a separate item on tonight's agenda. Customer decarbonization, also tried to look at a number of these factors from an implementation perspective. Also remove the term smart from that category. We have never defined smart, and so it didn't feel appropriate to include that without a definition. Although when we look at conservation, energy efficiency, demand response, a number of these different pieces do come together. They are considered resources. They're considered customer side resources, which is again probably most targeted and most implemented through the integrated resource planning process. But felt it was an important part of what we do, which is to help customers to conserve and be more efficient. And then finally, added a number of different links to implementation that we're looking at relative to resiliency and risk to EWEB and our planning process, which includes a number of things like wildfire planning, for example. So made a number of different references there. Next slide, please. The final area that we added to the SD15. We in essence gutted the last section and turned it into an implementation guidance section. This is where we look and make sure that we're looking at major decisions from a triple bottom line perspective. And this is where we added and made reference to the equity desires of the board that were expressed last month. We also wanted to make sure there was a strong connection to the annual goals. That's actually one of the things that we'll talk about next in this meeting, is the annual goals that are consistent with other board policies, and that certain milestones and metrics can be, when appropriate, annualized and not just looked at from a longer term perspective. And then also identifying the frequency of reporting, which right now by default is quarterly, but it could be changed if the board felt that was appropriate. And then finally, reiterating the importance of at least annually making sure that we continue to compile and report emissions reductions and our basically our carbon inventory, if you will, across the organization, which can be used to, and much of that is tracked and published because this time of year for the previous year, much of that because we have to wait to get Bonneville's numbers until later in the year, but we do feel it's important to maintain that that degree of transparency with both the board and the public. And so we added a section specifically around some of the criteria that we heard around implementation and the importance of implementation. Next slide, please. So for tonight's meeting, I tried to take what I heard last month and bring back, work with staff and bring back some changes to the policy that we felt represented what we heard last month. There's a couple of options going forward. We can, and tonight's meeting again is around the deliberating and providing further guidance if needed. There's two potential paths forward. One, if there's really just minor revisions that the board feels are appropriate at this point, we could bring this back as a consent approval item next month. That would typically be via resolution, because anytime you change a board policy, that typically requires a resolution, but it could be done with a consent item in January. Or if the board feels that it's worth further deliberation and discussion, that the gaps are wide enough either between individual commissioners or between what was proposed or presented and where you'd like to take it, then we could schedule additional time for further discussion in January. But we took what we thought we heard and we provided you both a clean copy of a new SD15, given that the track changes on the old one was probably going to be very messy. And so both were provided as part of the backgrounder, and I would be happy to entertain questions or really at this point listen to the board and your conversation around, is this hit the mark or not? So with that, President Schlossberg, I will turn it back to you for further discussion.
Great, thank you. Is there anybody that wants to start off with questions or comments first? Does anybody have any questions or comments? Sonia.
Trying to not jump in there first. That's okay. Yeah, I really appreciate all the work around this. I like the categories. I really appreciate the inclusion of the equity. The one question I have is on the on the levels of reduction, specifically in the operations category. I think I know the answer to this, but I just want to double check. Because it's targeted on 2009 levels, whereas I know, some of the other kind of groups like the City of Eugene, theirs is based on 1990 levels. Is that because that's when we have our baseline data? And so going back to 2000 or 1990 would be kind of a stretch to say, oh, well, this is what our levels were in 1990. Or is there some of the reason that we chose that level?
So there's a couple of reasons that we chose that level. We had data back to that starting in 2010 basically, and so, or starting 2009. So that made sense to us. I do believe that the climate action plan from the city of Eugene uses 2010 as its baseline, which is probably again for data gathering type of purposes. You're right though, Commissioner Carlson, there are a number of different, I'll say broad goals that go back to the 80% below 1990 levels, and that has to do with the original Kyoto Accords that go back into the early 90s. And so, and that's a broader standard that I think a number of organizations use, and then they try to translate that into, well, what does that mean that we can actually get data for? So that's the reason that we chose 2009 as our baseline to begin with.
I'm more concerned that it aligns kind of locally as we're trying to coordinate our reduction efforts, and then we make sure that whatever we're reducing is, you know, in line to, I mean, we only have a certain portion that we're responsible for of the world. And so I recognize that, you know, there's a limit there, but I do appreciate the numbers in there and the plan. I also really appreciated the ramping up of levels in the power generation side too, even though we are very clean, just continuing to focus on that and make sure that we're not, you know, changing that mix. And it's so important to have that as a metric that we're tracking and something that we're looking at and reporting on so that we pay attention to it in all the decisions that we make as well. So thank you for the work on this. Those were my couple of comments. I don't think personally that they're, you know, I would be willing to support it tonight, or not tonight, but, you know, in our next meeting when we have the resolution. But if others have concerns, I'm more than willing to push it off to make sure that, you know, the board itself and all the people in it are comfortable with it. So I'm fine either way, and I look forward to hearing others' responses.
Thank you, Commissioner Carlson. I would say that going from 90 to 95% is not easy, but it is certainly achievable. I think where we really start to see major impacts to other arenas is when you start going from 95% to 100. At least that's what most of our data starts to show, is that and I will tell you, within the past 5 years, there have been there was a 2019 in particular where we were below 90%. And it was because hydro conditions, we had planned on Leeburg being in full service that year. We also took Carmen Smith offline for some work. And so hydro conditions do impact that 90% on a year-on-year basis. That's part of why I think the wording in there said on a planning basis, but that doesn't mean that we can't handle contingencies. So I don't want people to think that 95% is not achievable. I think it is. I also think it's going to take conscious effort to get there, which I think is one of the purposes of having a target. So, and then there are contingencies that I think the board needs to be able to weigh into relative to the impact on other things like reliability or affordability or some of those things. And so there's some contingencies built in there, but those would be very intentional that the board would review as we pursue it.
All right. Anybody else want to jump in the queue?
Sure, I'll jump in. Yeah, thank you for the work on this. I did have one small question, and it's in the markup document that we got, and it's under the power generation section. About halfway down, the words safety and reliability are crossed out, of a sentence that used to be there. And I'm just, anytime that safety and reliability gets crossed out, it concerns me. I'm sure that it's being covered someplace else in the document, but if you could just speak to why you felt it was important to take those out of that section in the power generation thing, that would be one of my questions.
Yes, thanks, Commissioner Borofsky. There are still contingencies mentioned around the pursuit of going from 90 to 95%. I think it mentions that within criteria that can be set up, and I believe the very next sentence talks about the use of the integrated resource plan is where you specify that. I didn't actually believe that it was important to have a roster of that criteria in the policy. You could have also added affordability, reliability, safety. I mean, you could have really gone through this and just listed it out. It wasn't to remove the contingency. It was just trying to link that contingency to the actual implementation, which takes place elsewhere. I think you'll also notice a couple times we just referred to emissions and not carbon emissions. That was another change, recognizing that not all greenhouse gases are directly related to a carbon dioxide, for example. But so, for example, we have used a lot of SF6 in some of our equipment, which is 23,000 times more potent than CO2. So there were a few changes like that, but it was not to diminish the importance. It just simply made reference elsewhere to it.
Okay, and then again, this is just me looking at things and wondering why or what if we need to add more to it. In the first section, you say that greenhouse gas emissions from human activity, and it talks about that the energy industry, agricultural and transportation sectors generally identified as the primary sources. For me, I would also add possibly the construction. I mean, transportation, and I'm specifically talking about concrete. The use of concrete is a major emitter of CO2. I think it's 7% of the world's emission of CO2, and that's could be covered in transportation, but it's also the building sector. So I don't know if we want to add that as a major contributor. When you talk 7% globally, that to me is a major contributor. And then lastly, in summing up, I'm in forward of moving this forward. I think it's important enough to have a standalone action item, not just a consent calendar. I would like the resolution to be part of the agenda, not just a consent calendar, so that we can stand up and say, this is what we're doing as far as our board policy on climate action, rather than just approving it in the consent calendar. If it wasn't the consent calendar, I would pull it and bring attention to it. I think it's that important that we stand up and say what we're in favor of. And so with that, I would say thank you for the hard work. And one last thing is, I think that it would also be good when we're doing this major of a renovation to a policy to have a check back on it, possibly in a year, and see if it's capturing what we want it to do, so that when we make the resolution, we say, let's look at this again next year in December and make sure it's doing what we want it to do, and see if there's any additions or changes that we want to have happen. Thank you.
Commissioner Borofsky, just one follow-up question to that. We would typically have scheduled a board policy review in December for all of the board policies. Would that suffice, or would you want a separate item when we do make a change that's fairly major, separate agenda item for that?
I think it could be rolled into that board policy thing, but maybe give a little bit stronger emphasis to it, since it's a newer revised policy.
Great, thank you. And I don't believe there would be any issue with adding construction to the list of major contributors, and also adding this as an agenda item in January. I think that's appropriate.
All right, Matt, do you have any comments or questions?
Me and the mute button. We're having a fight. All right, I think I won. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity. Thanks for the revisions, Frank. And I appreciate and agree with Commissioner Borowski's thoughts about process in terms of adopting this particular policy and making sure that, and coming back to revisit and make sure it's doing what we want it to do. Thank you for those suggestions, John. Frank, again, I'm grateful for your work on this. I feel like it's moving in the right direction. I appreciate the link between the board policy and the location of related targets that don't necessarily need to be in this particular policy. I appreciate you speaking to the location question right at the front of the presentation, because that's a question that I think is important for us to continue to discuss through the IRP. And I do feel strongly that we need a separate equity policy. So I guess at some point here, I would move that we take steps to put that in place. And Frank, I don't know if you want to draft something or if you want the board to work on something. You guide us on how to start that, but I feel we do want to get that ball rolling. So thank you. A couple of specifics to confirm: our current level of carbon-free electricity is 90%. It hovers right around there. Is that right?
It hovers right around 90%. If you think about kind of that average of, if I were to put it in carbon intensity, the 0.025 to 0.05 kind of range. So it is typically but around a little better than 90%. It certainly is not consistently at 95, but it hovers right around there.
Right, and I think stating these like on an annual basis, I think as you have, is the right way for us to, like, can't keep it exactly some rate over the course of a year. It's just the average over a year. So, and I think aiming for 95% by 2030 is a good target. Would we all love to see 100%? Sure. I think moving to 95% over the next 9 years is a solid move and gets us absolutely in line with a reasonable target. I do think for readers of this policy, it would be useful for us to define carbon-free. And I'm not sure how you think about it, Frank, but in terms of, is it just a list of specific resources that we categorize as carbon-free, or is it actually the carbon intensity? And then if it is the carbon intensity, that's super wonky language to put into a policy, but maybe we want to at least put a footnote of, like, this is what we mean by carbon-free. I think that would be valuable. I noted that where you struck out the word carbon emissions, and I agree that carbon emissions may be too limiting. I would propose that we say greenhouse gas emissions so that we're capturing the whole thing. The trouble in my experience is that if we just say emissions, it can get construed to all kinds of different emissions that have nothing to do with greenhouse gases, and so veer off away from the climate change piece that we're focused on in this particular policy. I have two proposals, and I'm curious where the rest of the board would be on this. It feels to me like this would be an appropriate place for us to state our desire for all new EWEB buildings to run on electricity, that we don't design buildings that would run on natural gas, for example. I know that's it, I think it's consistent with what we have here. It's a slight departure from what's already in here. So I'd be interested in whether you all feel like that's appropriate, and if not, maybe there's another way for us to provide that statement of that desire if the rest of the board feels that that's a useful goal for us to establish. And then Commissioner Borowski brought up embodied emissions, particularly in concrete, and I do think it will be valuable for us to make sure we're including those within our greenhouse gas inventory of internal operations, so that we're, to the extent possible, where EWEB is purchasing concrete or steel or high intensity products that we're reporting that as well. I have a couple other questions, but I'll leave them for later. They're not pressing. Thanks.
All right, John Brown, are you still on?
I'm still here. Thank you. A little later than you, but I'm still here. Thank you. And I agree with most everything that's been said. I do have a question, Frank, about, we're at 90 plus or minus now, wavering to 95. It's kind of like stadium safety. We get up there, we get to that last 5%, and it just costs way too much. And so when we have that measure of cost of achieving 100%, I know that it's very challenging. That aside, where does nuclear stand in this conversation about renewable versus carbon-free? Because that's part of the portfolio that Bonneville has.
So, Commissioner Brown, generally speaking, you touched on a good point about definitions. I would say nuclear is in general classified as carbon-free. Most states do not consider it renewable. So it's not considered renewable, but it is considered carbon-free. There are new developments taking place regarding small modular reactors. An organization called NuScale, for example, which is out of Oregon State, from Oregon State. So those are probably in the 2030 kind of time frame. Based on where they are in their regulatory licensing as far as any kind of option. And right now it's about 7%, I believe, of Bonneville's portfolio is the Columbia Generating Station. It's somewhere in that range. I don't know if that's the specific number.
Okay. And then a question about the concrete. I understand the desire to get that into the conversation, but I also understand that if that's just limited to us, because I look for examples in the marketplace when LTD is building MX and BRT, all of those routes have to be concrete because electric buses are so heavy they can't be accommodated. And that's the more concrete's been poured to accommodate that alternative transportation than any other construction projects, all other construction projects combined based upon some of the information I've had. Will that affect, because I know that we went through that conversation when we built the Rock. The initial plan was to have a concrete parking lot because it had a 30-year life versus our asphalt that now has a 15-year life. And it was a cost issue because we had to cut $30 million off of it. Are we going to run the risk of getting into a place where we're not talking about financial feasibility about what we're doing?
So I would actually classify the question a little bit differently, Commissioner Brown. I do believe that when we're making major decisions, including those related to our own operations, we do need to use the triple bottom line approach and look at the balance between the social, economic, and environment. That's to include things like the impacts of construction, both financially as well as environmentally. So I think that's got to be an important part of those major decisions. And I'm not sure that I would, it is captured actually in the climate change policy, but I think it may be captured elsewhere as well regarding the use of the triple bottom line approach. So I think that that's covered under that particular implementation paragraph. I do hesitate a little bit when we start getting into, and I can't remember the class distinctions, but there's a number of different class distinctions around trying to track things that are market-based versus what you influence yourself. And we tried to, and I think this probably predates me at EWEB. I think that's probably why the operational targets were set based on carbon reduction and not based on specific activities or classes, and did not include those sort of class 3 or class 4 kinds of emissions, or market-based sort of emissions, or I guess I could say consumer-based emissions. So that's I mean, we can track that probably project by project. I'm not sure that we have the bandwidth to track all of the concrete we use, for example, on all of our projects. So I'll have to explore that particular piece a little further.
Well, more particular, just for an example, Lieberg, what we have to do to bring that to the million-year standard. I'm pretty sure we're not going to do it with construction materials that I understand other than concrete, and I don't want to make sure that we're consistent with what we're doing, that we're not boxing ourselves in, that we're in a catch-22 there. So just food for thought. So thank you. I appreciate it. I'm going to support it as revised, and appreciate all the hard work that you and staff have done to get us where we are. Thank you.
I really appreciate this, Frank. I find this version to be very readable and easy to understand. I also appreciate you giving us the markup version too, so we can see what it was before. I think that it is clear. It makes it clear for us in a year or 6 months or a year when we come back and look at how we're doing, that kind of the different buckets that you've put everything in. Makes it easy to tease out that information. So I support adopting this with the changes and tweaks that other board members have suggested. And also I like John Borowski's suggestion that this be kind of a standalone thing that we adopt at our next board meeting and not just package it in with the consent calendar, because I think it's pretty important. And it sounds like everybody is supportive of it. And so I think it's important for us to publicly take a stand and saying these are the values that we support and that we want to see in the agency. And I see some more hands, and Matt, you had said you had also had some more questions. So is it okay with everyone if we just do a second go around for those who want? Okay, I'm going to start with John Borowski and then Matt, and if Sonia or John have anything else you can chime into.
Thanks, Mindy. Yeah, I just wanted to make clear that when I was talking about the concrete, that was in the first line, and it basically said that these are the areas that contribute to the major contributors to greenhouse gases throughout the whole economy. You know, it's agriculture, it's industry, it's transportation, and I just wanted to call out construction as part of that. I in no means meant that we should be tracking our concrete and the emissions that are there. I just wanted it in the board policy that we recognize that there are factors that are within our control and there are factors that are not within our control. You know, to a certain extent, we can look at concrete and do the triple bottom line on those on certain instances, but it was by no means my intention to have that be part of the policy. It was just another major factor in the greenhouse gases that the world produces. So that was my intention. I just wanted to make that clear. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner Borowski. I probably interpolated something a little bit too much because I took some of Commissioner McCrae's comments around supply chain and your comments around construction, and I sort of mind melded those two together. I will note that Andrew Janos from our environmental department did point out that we tracked supply chain emissions from 2009 to 2014. The big challenge in that is that many of your supply chain GHGs are estimates, and they do vary quite a bit. And so that does become difficult to track. But the point is taken that when we do have major projects or major decisions, that the triple bottom line where we're looking at environmental impacts is an important thing to consider in those decisions. And so that's, I believe, an important aspect that this should call out.
All right, Matt.
Thanks, Mindy. Yeah, you don't have to take the blame for that, Frank. That was me directly making comments about concrete and the value of tracking it. So I will dive into concrete very briefly because is such a substantial source of emissions, and EWEB does buy a lot of it. I'm not suggesting we stop using concrete. It's very valuable. From my perspective, it would be valuable in our internal greenhouse gas inventory to like track the top 5 items that have the greatest greenhouse gas intensity. And we already do that with refrigerants, right? Those are at the top of the list. But if we tracked concrete and steel, that probably captures the other 2. Well, and then chlorine, right? We have other chemicals that we use that are high emissions or have high emissions potential. It just, from my perspective, if we can track those things that have high greenhouse gas intensity and report them, not that we necessarily have to do anything about them, but just tracking them puts it on our radar and helps us think about, how much of that we're buying. The other thing is that there are low carbon concrete mixes that are not sci-fi. They're available today. They sometimes take a couple days longer to cure, but they have higher strength when they're cured. But there has to be demand for those in order for that to start to get used regularly. And because we do have demand, I think we're one of those entities that could kind of push the market towards lower carbon concrete. So I'll stop on the concrete piece, but I do feel like it's valuable for us to pay attention to those scope 3 emissions. And to the extent that other board members are supportive of us tracking that, I think that would be super valuable. The other question I had, I think, is about operation emissions. The language in here is that we're planning to reduce our net emissions from operations by 25%, 50%, et cetera. I'm curious how we're thinking about net emissions. Are there carbon sinks or other offsets that we would count in there as a part of the net total?
I think the term net, Commissioner McCray, opens up the possibility that we could, if we got to that point. I think in particular when you start looking at net carbon neutral in 2050, I think that starts to become part of the tool bag. I don't believe that we actually do that presently. I believe that most of our reductions so far have been direct reductions, so we have not, but the term net was put in there specifically to open that possibility if needed.
Okay, thanks. And it looks like Adam jumped on there, might have something to add. Or but maybe not. My bad. I was just so sorry. I was looking at the lineup of boxes, the ever-changing boxes on my window. That's all that I had. I am curious if there's support among other commissioners around new construction of new EWEB buildings, but that's also a conversation that we can have at a next meeting. I don't feel like we have to push that into today. So thanks for the time.
Commissioner McCray, would just to follow up on that particular item, is, I actually kind of view that as something that would fall under the operations reduction category. That we're moving from whatever we were in 2009 to 25% to 50% to eventually carbon neutral, and that sort of the goal by itself would lend or push the organization towards decisions like that. That's kind of how I view some of those particular issues, as opposed to I would almost view what you described as a tactic falling within those carbon goals. But it's still a valid question for the board, and I'm not trying to discourage that. I just view that as part of that goal.
So I agree, and I'm going to bring out an example that I think makes the point that it could be valuable. That I think we had these goals on the record in 2010, right? Ish. EWEB had these goals on the books when we built the Rock, and my understanding is that the Rock uses natural gas for heating, right? So even though we had clear objectives around reducing operational emissions, we still built this super long-lived building using natural gas. So suggesting that maybe it's not as clear as it could be, or that additional board direction there might be valuable.
Yeah, I think that's the issue with that, and I think it's pointing out that we use natural gas at both headquarters and the rock is an appropriate thing to point out. The design of the rock was well before the adoption of this policy in 2010. So that was being designed in 2007, 2008. So there was a misalignment of timing there, and I would hope that this being policy and talking about reductions of operations would have a different effect today than it did back then.
Yeah, fair point. Thanks, Frank.
Great, Sonia, you're thinking about raising your hand?
I just wanted to kind of build on that. I mean, I do think it would be valuable to call that out even as a separate category, although I did kind of toy with it with the construction piece being under operations, just because it is such a big part of what we do, and to ensure that it is seen, it's a separate category that does really have a big impact. Now, I guess we need to define, what kinds of building and to what level we would track that, because, does concrete refill in in a roadway, does that count, or is it just major building work that we're doing? What if we're just doing repairs? I don't know. It starts getting into the weeds for me. So I think I would almost like to sit on that one for a little bit and think about kind of what the implications would be. But I do agree that maybe, having a different category that calls it out, at least for very major projects, would be valuable to have that as a policy statement. This is what we support as a board. And I'd look to, Frank and others for where the lines are drawn there. As far as the adding the concrete or the building portion up in the kind of list of industries, I mean, for me, that, that's fine. That works for me if you want to, if we want to go that path. I'm also okay if we don't have all of those in there. I don't think it really adds anything to the policy, other than, because we need to focus on what we're doing. And then I do really I really appreciate the idea of having this pulled back out as its own separate item during the next meeting to discuss. So that's my quick feedback. Thanks.
Yeah, commissioners, on the scope, I'll call them the scope 3. Those are the use of sort of the supply chain. I will get with staff to try to understand that a little bit better. As much as you might think we use a lot of concrete, I'm not sure that we use a lot of concrete. There's there may be some relative to foundations in substation, but or some street repairs or things like that. I'm struggling to see, short of sort of building a hydro facility, where we actually, I'll get with staff to try to understand that baseline a little bit more. Just to get some kind of scope to it. My comments on Commissioner McCrae's polling of the board regarding buildings, I took that as EWEB buildings in the future specifically, which I included as part of operations. So just I treat that separately from the issue of scope 3 or supply chain kind of for our own projects. So I will investigate those separately.
Sorry, just to that end, it did the 2009 baseline report include that kind of work? I guess that would be the thing to ask too, because if we're expecting it to be included and then it wasn't included before, what would that mean? I'm just curious as we look on it.
Okay, I can include that in the next session, but the reduction targets were around scope 1 and scope 2, which is really direct direct contribution of greenhouse gases. So the scope 3 was reported for a while, but that was not what was the basis for the reduction.
John Brown, do you have anything for a second go around?
Yeah, I do. Thank you. And you know, I don't have a problem with the construction of EWEB facility, but when we have that conversation, I want to make sure that we talk about our second source and our water treatment facility and how we're going to do that to essential service and still comply with that intent. The same thing with some of our reservoirs, because they're all concrete. And I don't know if the technology and things are there. You know, we've already gone from 70 million to 90 million on second source treatment facility, and what that will do to A, the feasibility of even doing it, and then B, if we can do it, and two, things such as the cost. I caution that we think this out, but because we do have some major projects coming on that probably have been contemplated using traditional construction characteristics and materials, and if we're trying to go into a new thing and we're trying to make it seismic resilient, that we think this through before we go too far with it. So I'm not afraid to have the conversation, but I just want to make sure we look at everything other than just making sure that we may not use concrete. Thank you.
All right, and there's nothing else from me. So Frank, did you get what you needed from this conversation?
I did, President Schlossberg, and so thank you, commissioners, for the guidance both last month and this month. I think there are some, what I would classify as sort of fairly minor revisions to this. We will schedule this as a separate action item for January. And then also make sure that next December, when we review board policy, we will include this as a particular call out to a board policy that needs review. But I do think I got enough guidance to make some changes, and I will do the same thing that I did this month. I will call out, I will include a markup in the difference between what was the clean version that you got this time versus the new version next time, and look forward to hopefully a good discussion and an approved resolution that will implement a new climate change policy for EWEB and the future of EWEB. So thank you.
Thanks, Frank.
Thank you very much. Okay, our last major work item is agenda item number 13. It's our work session on the 2022 organizational goal development. So back to you, Frank.
Well, commissioners, good evening once again. This is Frank Lawson, General Manager. Joining me in this presentation will be Rodney Price, the Assistant General Manager. I'm going to run through a few things and go ahead with the next slide, if you will, Holly. Thank you. Our goal this evening, and I'll preface this by identifying that in the old days, we used to spend a number of, I saw, well, not we, because I wasn't the general manager then, but I witnessed a number of boards working with management over the course of several months to eventually get to the annual goals in about April or May, which didn't really seem like, they seemed like semi-annual goals at that point. Over the last couple years, we have pulled that in to where management proposes for your consideration the annual goals in January, and typically those have been approved either in January or February, depending on feedback from the board. What we're doing now and what we'd like to get your feedback on today is we've proposed just some sample organizational goals, and we'd like to understand from your perspective what some of our priorities should be as we go into that process, so that when we bring the first round of proposed annual goals back to the board next month, that we'll be in better understanding of what you're looking for. So next slide. A little bit about kind of where we are Again, one of the things about annual goals, we're kind of in this yellow area. We're going to propose some goals. We're going to try to understand your priorities. We will also kind of weigh that versus what we know as far as where we are strategically and where we are from an organizational performance perspective, so that we hopefully can come back next month and get some annual goals approved, of which the next step after that is to develop very specifically, management will develop the metrics and milestones to be able to report back to you on a quarterly basis our progress or lack thereof toward the pursuit and hopefully the achievement of the annual goals throughout the year, typically reported in May, August, and November, and then the annual goals, the summary for the previous year in March. So this is just to give you an indication as to the process that we're looking at here and the role that we're looking for tonight. Next slide, please. There, typically going to be kind of three types of goals. You'll notice these are color-coded. Mr. Price is going to run through some of our proposed 2022 goals a little later on, and you'll notice some colors, and the colors kind of match up with the type of goal that they are. There are some goals that are just perennial goals. You want to make sure that your operational performance is up to expectation. We have a number of board policies that we fulfill that you've already provided direction on. There are a number of still active resolutions. There are certain metrics and understanding that we just want to make sure that these track according to the expectations to make sure that our organizational performance is on track and what you expect. There are also, and those tend to be perennial and they look kind of similar from year to year. But basically, if I were to summarize those goals, they would be operate the utility the way you're supposed to and the way we have told you to operate it. So that's kind of how those would appear. The ones in red can kind of come and go, and those are either based on gaps, weaknesses, strengths, opportunities. There's emerging issues that can come up or opportunities. Those tend to be in red. Sometimes those are, like I said, an area that you want to improve. Maybe one year you decide or you find out that there's an area that you're not performing as well as you would like to. So it becomes something that to improve the next year or identify something that needs attention. And then the third category is strategic, and those, if you start to extract the strategic plan, you'll start to see some goals that appear to be foundational, but there's various elements that you might see a year or two and then they might come or go. AMI would be an example of that, where that's building a capability that's strategic that then can feed into new products or IRPs or other types of resources that are and tools that are going to need to balance your supply and demand. So there's really business fundamentals, discrete opportunities that come and go, and then really tactical annual milestones related to strategic objectives and positioning the utility in the future. So those are kind of the three areas. Next slide. I won't run through all of these. These are, again, looking at the color codes, just some examples. COVID-19 was one that I would call an emergent. We didn't necessarily have an annual goal around that, but that was, it took a lot of attention and modified how we were operating. Even when you start to look at an emerging issue of a Lieberg Canal, that's something that wasn't necessarily a strategic initiative, but something that we feel like we need to address. That would fall into one of those that might be around for a year or two and then come and go. And then some of the business fundamentals you can see around quality, water quality, reliability, financial metrics, some of those things. And then where we are strategically, integrated resource planning, AMI, some of our informational systems, rate making, which is going to be something that we feel that the board and management need to work on pretty significantly over the next couple of years. So these were just some examples. I know that you received this slide ahead of time, so I won't run through all of them, but just to give you a feel for kind of the types and styles of how we classify the goals. Next slide, please. So with that, we did, as part of the backgrounder, provide you some food for thought relative to what some of the areas of opportunities that we saw with the goals. And with that, I will pass it off to Mr. Price, who can run through these with the board, and then we'll open it up for feedback and suggestions after that. Rod?
Yeah, thank you, General Manager Lawson. Commissioners, good evening. For the record, on the audio folks, my name is Rod Price. I think one of the things Frank didn't say is on that previous slide, you could have put et cetera, under that. And we've all heard tonight about the opportunities that are coming along and the expanded budgets and all this. And I think one of the things that you know, we need to do as we consider organizational goals is how do you funnel these down to 5 to 10 things to work on so we can maintain our focus and stay within our resources that you folks are bringing to us and putting around the table for us. So I think another thing I would say real quick about that particular slide too is if you didn't see something up there and you've got this pet project and idea, you know, now's the time to start talking about it and bringing it out. And let Frank kind of shoot it down or build it up, whichever he's going to do or we're going to do, right? So one of the things I wanted to do, though, is talk a little bit about some of these goals that we put up. I think it's important that the goals are tied to, especially at the organizational level, tied to things that the board can influence. And that not only can you influence, you can measure and monitor where they're at. And so one of the ways we measure and monitor where they're at is the quarterly report. And so we centered the quarterly report around the organizational goals. So you get some pretty direct feedback on that. So that first goal that's listed there is identifying something that has come out of the quarterly reports, which is improving customer responsiveness. And this covers a variety of the metrics that I think that you've seen coming out. I think call wait times is an easy one to call out, but certainly that came out of the quarterly report. And so that's an area of potential focus for us moving ahead. The other thing we're talking about for 2022 is focusing on operations, workforce, and finance areas. And so there's some language here reflected around our dynamic workforce, which is policies around our new hybrid and way we want to move ahead, working with telecommuting and mobile workforce and so forth. I think the other big thing that's really coming up from a workforce perspective, though, is the collective bargaining agreement will start next year. So those are good examples of things that we do on a day-to-day basis, and it will affect our world moving ahead. Frank talked about sometimes you can have a goal that mixes up things. So we have the work that Travis has brought to the table a number of times here to the board, and talked about the need for a new CIS and a enterprise-wide kind of software implementation process. And so I think that's the other thing where the board gets a lot of feedback. You'll see a lot of our goals being presented during the board meetings. If you think back on the presentations you're getting around the Lieber Canal or whatever it is, these are all goals that are being set up from an organizational perspective. So next slide, please. Thank you. And I guess the other thing I would say real quick about the organizational goals, you know, they need to tie to our strategic plan. They need to tie to our goals, our values in that plan. But I think something that's sort of not as clear maybe is the goals need to be clear. They need to be as clear as stated as possible. And the one thing I kind of like to say or emphasize a little bit is they need to be inspirational to performance. You know, I'll pick on my friends in finance, you know, a multi-year rate design plan, that's probably really exciting for them, and they get that right away, right? But the rest of the goal sort of ties in the strategic plan and how it relates to the rest of the people that are going to be involved in that, because it's a big process. So by considering our goals and things that you think about and talk about, so those are all some of the areas that we tend to focus on when we craft these goals. So I would say with that, the real point of this is to hear the board's feedback. So Commissioner Schlossberg, I'll turn it over to you to get some input.
All right. Well, I'm going to go first this time, just to mix things up a little bit. One thing that I noticed, you have something about the dynamic workforce, but something that we hear about occasionally is that we have difficulty recruiting and hiring for some key positions. I know that at our last board meeting on our consent calendar, we approved a contract for a lot of money for a position that we weren't able to recruit for. And I'm just curious if that is something that would rise to an organizational goal for the year, to kind of look at how can we fill some of these key positions so that we don't find ourselves in that same situation.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion. I think one of the things that if you look in the background of the dynamic workforce, some of the principles are the reason we're doing that is to help with recruiting and retention both. But duly noted. I think it's a good observation.
President Schlossberg, I think that's a really good observation. The dynamic workforce model is probably a subset of that. It probably doesn't encapsulate what you just described more broadly. I think one of the, in fact, it's not just an emerging issue, it's also a strategic issue that we've identified. And when we speak of resiliency, we speak about workforce resiliency and recruiting and retention and dynamic workforce models, which is really a hybrid telecommuting model, if you want an interpretation of that. All of those are subsets of that, but I think that your comment might mean that we need to broaden that particular goal out a little bit to include more specifically, potentially the organic development of some workforce positions that are hard to fill. So that's a really good suggestion.
Great, thank you. That's all that I have right now, but John Borowski, I see your hand raised.
Thank you, Mindy, and that is exactly what I was going to bring up too. The fact that I think spelling out dynamic workforce and putting recruitment and retention in there, because there's just certain, you can't telecommute alignment, right? There's certain positions, we, like she said, the meter technician. These are bodies that we need. So I guess one of my questions would be, yes, I would like to see that put in there a little bit more so we have metrics. How many unfilled positions do we have per quarter? And what are we doing to recruit and retain those positions would be a metric that I would like to see. And on the other side of that, you talked about the contract bargaining agreement. I'm not sure where this goes, but I know a lot of industries are giving signing bonuses and things like that. And I'm just wondering if that would have to be something that's going to be negotiated into that contract, that, hey, we want to bring in more linemen, but the only way that we can do that is by giving them a $20,000 signing bonus. Is that something that has to be negotiated with IBEW, or is that something that we can do as a policy on our own? So that would be a question that I would have, but I know that that's, in a lot of other industries, that's what's out there to get these bodies to come to your workforce. And so if that does have to be bargained, I think that that's something that I would like to have looked at, so that there's the opportunity to use all the tools in the toolbox to fill our workforce. And then I had one more question, and this doesn't really go to this goals, but Frank said in the beginning, that there's a bunch of resolutions and directions that we're following as we go. As I get to say this for the last time this month as a new commissioner. It would be interesting to know what resolutions are out there that we are bound to follow, and are there resolutions that are out there that are dated and need to be stricken from the books? You know, I mean, I know all organizations have legacy directives that may be sitting back there somewhere that either are not applicable or just don't go to where the goals that we have now. So it'd be interesting to me to see what the resolutions that we are bound by, and maybe do a look into seeing if they're still relative.
Commissioner Borowski, I know we have records back to, well, I know that we have folders with records back to 2000. The last inventory we did, there was still 40 to 50 that were active. We can certainly do that. Resolutions are one means of which the board provides direction, like you've actually approved a number this evening relative to budgets and other things. I'll work with staff to try to get what you're looking for. I don't know what the timing on that would be, but I'll make sure. A number of different things. Policy is also the board policies are pretty significant. Customer service policies, those types of things, those direct us as well. So I didn't want to overemphasize resolutions, but there are a number of them.
All right. Anyone else want to jump in next? Matt, then Sonia.
Thank you. First, this is helpful, continues to be helpful, and I appreciate the goals that are here and that you're proposing, especially around Lieberg. I think making a decision on that sooner than later, or at least setting a time frame by which we want to make a decision there, I think is really useful. So thank you for proposing that, as well as the rest of these public draft of the IRP. That seems really valuable. All the things that are here feel like substantive and valuable to be included here. On the issue, it's less about resolutions, but more about board policies. I know we've had some discussion about updating board policies. I don't know if it's reasonable. I don't know how much we're all going to want to dive into all the details of every board policy, but it does feel like perhaps reviewing and revising some portion of them over the course of each year would be a good way to keep those fresh and accurate and relevant. Like I said, I don't know if we can do it all. Maybe we could go through all of them in a year. And I'm okay with setting our ambition a little bit less than that, because I know we have a lot of really meaty stuff to work on. Nick keeps just like dishing it up. And then the other question I have is, might we want a goal around workplace injuries? Not that we have more of them, but that we have none of them, or a very small number, or less than we had last year. My perception is that EWEB is a pretty safe workplace. And I know we're all pretty committed to seeing it remain that way. And it feels like a clear statement of our goal is to have zero significant injuries, or you tell me what's relevant there, but that feels like something that'd be valuable to include.
Commissioner McCray, we certainly are very safe utility, actually, and have a really robust program. The very first goal that talks about continuing to maintain and improve the organizational performance, that particular goal has probably, I'll just go out on, 50 metrics associated with it. There are a number of safety metrics, lost time, accidents, et cetera, and those are reported annually in great detail and quarterly in areas that actually vary enough quarterly to, or are important enough quarterly. So the safety metric, and in fact, one thing for the board to understand, whenever we come up with a goal, our next step is what milestones, what metrics do we have to develop or provide you to let you know we're on track or we're not off track. But the safety metrics are included in that very first goal as it's written now, just so you're aware. I think you're muted.
Thank you.
That was really important, and I'm sorry I missed it.
Super important. I forgot all of it, so I can't repeat it. I'm sorry. Thank you for pointing that out. Maybe having a separate goal around safety isn't essential as long as we're reporting it and tracking it that way. I do wonder, given our conversation, my last question, given our conversation around the climate policy, if we want to incorporate a goal around greenhouse gas emissions in any way within here. I don't know. It feels like, I don't know. It would be valuable for us to track regularly.
But potentially there's, so we have the integrated resource planning work, which is going to be incredibly important from that sort of first pillar or directive, I guess I would call it. We also included in that first goal track energy efficiency and conservation, which is an important piece of that from a customer perspective. The operations piece is not necessarily reported quarterly. That tends to be annually. So it's worth further consideration, but there's a number of different climate pieces that are included in various aspects of that, but we'll take a look at that.
Thanks, that's all I have.
All right, Sonia and then John Brown.
Okay, quick questions. Where does the reservoir, the like 40th and Patterson project and decommissioning College Hill, where does that fall into this framework? Is it under the water plan and the kind of the second slide of the draft goals?
Yeah, that would be under water assets and the priorities associated with water asset management. It also falls under the capital plan, which you actually approve on an annual basis. So all of those type 2 projects are included in very specific reporting throughout the year, and those are just really part of, I would say, part of normal operations.
Okay. Walter, oh, sorry.
No, and I was just going to say, given, never mind. It's just, there's a scaling issue that I was going to mention, but that's covered in the type 1, type 2 work.
Okay. Okay. And so then Walterville. So I see Leeburg is called out specifically on one of these slides. Is it because we were focusing on Leeburg and kind of getting that underway, then we were going to kind of put Walterville in as like a second step, so that wouldn't be in 2022. Is that right?
But yeah, that's correct. The time frame for Walterville is not driven by the same kinds of decision criteria as Leeburg. Leeburg has the emerging issue of the canal and decisions associated with the canal. I'm not even sure Walterville would be in the next few years, to be honest. It's a consideration in the long term, but you're absolutely right. There's a reason that Leeburg is in 2022, and there may be a follow-on goal in 2023 as well.
Okay, got it. And then, okay, so I see that in there. I think those were my 2. And so, just so I'm clear, because the first 2 are kind of numbered 1 and 2, and then it kind of leaves the rest of them off. Is that because it fits in that different framework with the red and the green? Or is there a different reason for kind of having those in not numbered that I'm missing?
That was just an oversight.
Okay. I just want to make sure it wasn't like we needed to get feedback on which one, kind of comes up in priority or anything like that.
No, those really should have been numbered for ease of conversation, but that was an edit that I missed.
Okay, no worries. It's interesting to me that we, a couple of things on just the process. We just set the budget, which somewhat solidifies the organizational goals, right? Because you set the budget to support the plan. It sort of seems like the goals are already set because you just set the budget. But I also get that we, and I appreciate the idea that we are looking at this ahead of, the next year, because the next year is when this all has to be implemented. But I also recognize that it's unique that right now we have all of the board members are going to be here through the next, this next January, but that's not always the case from a utility perspective. I mean, people do come and go, and, we do have to have that opportunity for the new board members, though I think it's challenging coming onto a new board and saying, okay, yes, these are the goals, but that is part of the job of that new board. So I don't want to lose track of that and locking that into the next board. It's something that we, I think it's a worthy goal, but it's something we're going to have to be cognizant of in future iterations of the board. But I appreciate the discussion. Thank you.
Commissioner Carlson, it is a good observation as to the sort of hamster wheel that we're on. A lot of these efforts intertwine. We have and actually I think it's really important to the continuity of the organization that we do have a pretty recurring cycle of strategic discussions, goal reviews, budgets, capital plans, long-term, and then it starts all over again. And I actually think that there's a really good purpose for that, which is that continuity of thought. And you could actually, in a perfect world, spend a lot of time developing a strategy, work on your operations plans and your budgets, and then and your goals, and then that drives your budgets. But the cycle time that we're on, especially given the lengths of projects that we tend to deal with, facilitates a little bit more of sort of this continuous process. And yeah, you're right. Sometimes it feels a little bit like this is before that and that's before this. And I think that's why the continuity of these efforts is important over time.
Absolutely.
And I think the ERP goal is a good example of that, where the balance of next year will be working on setting up a governance framework for a multi-year project and setting up the scoping for an RFP. And so we're not going to purchase the ERP system next year. We're going to prepare. How do we prepare the next year's budget and the 5-10 year plan? So the other thing I'd comment on, Commissioner Carlson, a couple of things. One is you touched on what's kind of a good question, right? Around where's the water master plan, right? One of the things I want to do is work on some resiliency type metrics that will kind of wrap in some of those. How are we doing in the big picture? And then Matt, a couple comments on yours. I think one of the things you're saying is, we're a safe utility. How safe are we, right? And so how do we answer that question? How safe is EWEB? And so that gave me sort of a little different mindset to work with Lance. I'd already been noodling some ideas. We'd been talking a little bit about Lance as our safety officer. So, and it's kind of the same thing with the carbon, the greenhouse gas kind of thing. Do you really want to know how we're implementing the new SD15 that we're working on, or do you want to know exactly how many carbon molecules we're saving or whatever? And I think really what you want to know is how how is EWEB as a whole working towards this goal in the DSD? So that's kind of how I took that, and that's how I would come back with some proposals.
All right, John Brown.
All right, thank you. I really appreciate everything that's been said. I just have two quick comments or questions about things. Just reassure me where is it a goal to continue to try and weatherize and make energy efficient our rental pool? Number one, and number two, if it's in there, could you show me where it is, or if it is not? And then affordability. Is that a goal, and if not, why not?
So, Commissioner Brown, the very first objective is where we would typically have our include our goals around energy efficiency. For example, it is something to warrant if the goal, if the board's desire was to pull out a specific sector or opportunity within that. We are viewing energy efficiency and conservation as operating and maintaining within what has already been established. And part of what's been established is that energy efficiency in our last integrated resource plan needed to offset organic growth. That's where our annual target comes in. It's typically around 10,000 megawatt hours. It does not call out specific sectors of the population. So that particular element is not included specifically. Affordability is not necessarily an end goal itself, as much as it is part of the values that we keep in play as we pursue the goals. So that's why it's listed in the strategic plan as a value as opposed to an end goal itself. It's obviously very important as to how we implement these things, but affordability, especially given the sort of long-term nature of it, and the fact that we revisit that on an annual basis, wouldn't necessarily be something that we would be tracking on a quarter by quarter basis. So I see that personally as more of a value that's listed as to a criteria for how we operate, not necessarily an end goal itself. Did that answer your questions?
It didn't. Maybe it answered my question, but I didn't understand the second one because to me, affordability should be a goal, or at least it should be a consideration, because it's 50% of our customers are in rental properties, and that's where maybe some people have more challenges on the affordable end of this, and this is a non-discretionary commodity that they have to have. They have to have water, they have to have electricity, and whatever we do, they have to adhere to. And if that's not a goal for us to keep it affordable for the majority of our population, it's a value, I get it, but if it's not a goal, I guess you'd have to tell me why it's not a goal.
So I think, Commissioner Brown, you said in your statement there, it should be a consideration. I think it's absolutely a consideration. And I do believe that it's something that we could consider around the specifics of looking at some of the programs specific for a limited income. But affordability to me is covered more in our strategic plan, where we do talk about maintaining our affordability. And we've done that historically through looking at our affordability index, for example, which is relative to median income, and some of the other things that you and some of the past board members have asked for. So I'm not sure what that goal would look like on a sub-annual basis, but I guess I appreciate that.
You give me an answer. Thank you. I'm done.
I guess, John, this is Rod. The way I would kind of see it is we've been given some spending authority in the budget, and what we try and do is optimize the spending within that budget that's given. So to me, that's where we're meeting our affordability goals by maintaining our budgets, and that's really what we're pretty focused on.
Okay, thank you.
All right, do you have what you need from us? But I see Sonia has her hand raised. Do people want another opportunity, or some people want another opportunity, or Sonia, do you have a clarification? Want to be mindful of time. So maybe we make it really fast, like 1 minute each, if that's possible. Okay.
If others are okay, if not, I can get it answered otherwise, but okay, real quick. Wildfire planning, where does that fall in here?
Rod, you want to take that one?
Yeah, we have both. We have about $1 million specifically earmarked in the capital budget, and then we have a number of programs that are, Janine calls them organic, that point towards those, both in O&M and in the capital. So one of the things you'll see in April, May, when we come back with the more final draft, you'll see some more defined metrics and numbers around programs that are earmarked for wildfires. So that will be coming up.
Okay. All right, that's it. Thanks. Done.
All right. John Borowski, 1 minute.
Yeah, and this is something that I think we touched on earlier, and I don't know if it needs to go into goals or where it falls, but I think the equity piece that we were talking about earlier, developing what that means and what that is and ways to measure it might be a goal that we could aspire to. And I'm not sure if that has risen to the level of this year's goals, but it's definitely right back there. So I just wanted to bring that up.
All right, John Brown, do you have anything else in a minute?
No, thank you.
Matt.
Yeah, I would like to echo John Brown's raise an issue about affordability. I think it's something that we all prioritize in a number of ways, and I think actually a goal around affordability would be useful. And I would say, I'm going to pull up the chart. You can't really see it. It's the chart that shows bill comparisons across a number of utilities that we consider comparators. And we could just set a goal about, like, we don't want to be on the top end of that, or we want to be somewhere in the middle, or, you know, we could set some goal around where we want to be in terms of affordability compared to our peers. I would argue that it should be around bills and not rates. But I do think it's valuable for us to think about how or where that might fit. I appreciate that affordability overall is, you know, it's a clearly stated within this goal document, but a specific goal around that could be valuable. That's all I have. Thank you.
Commissioner McCray, and I guess this would be for Commissioner Brown as well. I do believe that affordability as a goal, if it resides anywhere, it's probably in the strategic plan. And the part of the reason I say that is what you just mentioned was something that has a longer than an annual time frame to it. And so it would actually have to be something that would survive on an annual by annual basis. So, and I appreciate Mr. Price bailing me out with the budgetary comments, because oftentimes the budgets are set within the constraints of affordability. And so on an annual basis, being affordable, maintaining affordability is part of how we operate, and budget adherence is part of that. But if there's something that the board would want to actually state around, and this actually is what the board stated a number of years ago, and I think John Brown probably remembers that on the electric side, we were near the top of all our comparators, and I think the board said we'd like to get down into the middle of the pack somewhere. And so that was a goal that was, it was a multi-year goal, which is probably means it goes someplace differently. And I'm not quite sure how we would state that, but I can go back and review that in a little bit more of a strategic context. If that helps, if that would be helpful.
I'm just going to take my last minute, and Frank, I agree with you about that affordability piece. I mean, I think that we have these like central tenets or these central core values: affordability, reliability, safety, all those things. And I don't think that we need them to be in our organizational goals every year unless there's a problem. So if we were at the top end and we were looking at affordability, like, hey, we want to become more affordable and need to switch some things up. But I think that it is addressed just because it's one of those kind of key things that we look at throughout our organization. So that's my opinion on that. Okay, but Frank, I'm guessing that you got what you needed from us.
Yes, well, we really appreciate the feedback. I think from all of you, there were some things that we can glean out of this conversation and make adjustments so that what we bring back to you next month as proposed for your consideration will align with your thinking. And so I think the conversation was helpful to us, from really feedback from each of you. I have notes here that I think we'll take back and recraft and reorganize and make some edits too. So appreciate your feedback. We absolutely got, I think, what we needed. Thank you.
Thank you, and thank Rod too. Thank you, Rod. Okay, we are in the home stretch. Agenda item number 14, correspondence and board agendas. Frank.
So commissioners, there were 7 correspondence items this month, which is actually a fairly heavy load of correspondence. Some of those are traditional year-end items. Most of these, I would say, are follow-up items or things that we've been working on throughout the year, such as the wildfire mitigation plan and some other things that we agreed to provide. So most of the correspondence is that, but if you had any questions, either myself or staff can answer those or follow up later or next week during our check-ins, any of those. But if there's any questions, we'd be happy to answer those if needed.
Go ahead, John Brown.
Yeah, I just had a quick question regarding the greenhouse gas inventory. That has metrics that we're trying to hit by 2025 or by 2020, and then 2030 and 2050. And I'm just curious as to, when it comes to our internal greenhouse gas metrics, when and if we sell or lease the headquarters property, that's going to drop off of our greenhouse gas emissions. But I don't want that to be taken as, oh, we just made a huge gain because we're not using the natural gas to take care of the headquarters, somebody else is. I just want to make sure that that metric falls in line so that it doesn't look like we're getting a big gain when that happens.
Commissioner Borofsky, the secret is out. Darn, you caught us again in something here. No, I think it's, I was actually thinking about that too. I think it would warrant a reestablishing of the baseline. The emissions aren't going away. They're just going with the building. And so when we get to the point where we no longer own the headquarters building, we will adjust the metric to compensate for that. So I absolutely agree. It's worth making those adjustments when we get to that, and that will be duly noted by staff going forward.
Yeah, I mean, the example that I see is when you sell or get rid of a building, your facility deterioration report. You know, it's like all of a sudden we got rid of an old building and got a new building. Our backlog of deferred maintenance just went way down, and it looks really good on paper, but I don't want that to be corresponded in us meeting our metrics for 2030 and 2050.
Yep, that'll come off both sides of that ledger.
Thank you.
Anyone else have any questions for Frank, Matt, Sonia, or John Brown? Go ahead, John.
Okay, thank you. I just for the record, so I can get this in the record, you don't have to answer it tonight, Frank. On the wildfire mitigation plan, I really appreciate that, but I've always been an advocate that we're doing more than everybody else. An example is looking 35th to 50th on Willamette Street. We have our some pretty high voltage lines on top of the poles, but all the other communication people in town, Quest and all those other people, there are trees growing over them all over the place. And if we have a windstorm and those trees take the lines down, our power lines come down. And the PUC is not doing a darn thing to make those people trim those right of ways. And I just wish that hopefully we can press on that, because I know that's been a huge source of power outages when we have inclement weather in the winter, but I'm worried about it in the summer. So I just wanted to make that a record. And then I'd just like to ask you on the board officers liaison positions, the one about the headquarters property. I've got a lot of experience and background in disposing of large major public assets like this, and I'd like to help if I can, if that's be the will of the board. But I'm also worried about perception of conflict of interest, because of other people in my company have have a contract with EWEB to help you with real estate matters. And so could you research that in a legal aspect, because otherwise I'm going to have to step aside. I don't think it would, just because of the perception, although I know there won't be a conflict, it would be the optics of it. And I don't want that to come to EWEB. So could you research that legally before we get to the January meeting, please?
Yes, Commissioner Brown, we actually have done that research, and I can provide you some feedback during our check-in, and then also some correspondence feedback as part of the January backgrounder.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, Sonia, go ahead.
I also had a quick question on the appointees and liaisons group. So the City of Eugene, I know when we originally set that kind of relationship up, it was supposed to be specifically around our work together on climate policy. And we think we had the board president, and then Commissioner Schlossberg was the liaison specifically around the climate change piece. And in here, it represents it as kind of the board president and vice president, which obviously that's not what we have there. So I just want to clarify what's been happening during those meetings, and is that more of a leadership meeting, or is it just focused on kind of the climate aspect? Do we need to modify that role? What should we do with that position? I think that's I wanted to open that up.
Yeah, I think it's it's important, and I'll let President Schlossberg weigh in a little bit as to the content. I think if you go back far enough, there used to be leadership meetings between president and vice president and council president and vice president. You're correct. These meetings were set up specifically for a climate-related discussions. What I have found the meetings to be is a little bit more of a leadership kind of ad hoc. That's my personal observation, sort of the issues of the day, oftentimes climate, but other issues as well. And it almost feels like, from my perspective, that would be a better way to look at this going forward. because there are a number of issues. There's not just climate issues that we work with the city on. That for me seems more appropriate, but I would really heavily weigh into the board to tailor those liaisons a little bit more. But President Schlossberg, I guess appreciate your input.
Your question, Sonia, was what do we talk about? And that is a great question. I think that part of that kind of depends on who the counselors are that are on that committee as well. So the intention was to talk about climate stuff, but sometimes it is bled over into different topics, just depending on the familiarity with city council with some of the stuff that we do, I guess I'll say. I would say that lately it's gone a little bit more back towards climate, but I think one of the things that will make it a little clearer is that Frank and Sarah Maderi had talked about kind of really coming up with something for that group, like where exactly is the overlap, and presenting it to that little leadership group so that we can like really focus on those things, because it's kind of been all over the place sometimes, and sometimes it's pretty focused. So I would say we can, whatever we write on that document is fine, but we're still kind of in that relationship building phase. I think it's been a little slow, to be honest. That's my opinion.
Yeah, because I mean, you and I were on that 3 years ago, and I think you've continued being on that. So I was just curious because it did seem like it was kind of all over the board, and I just noticed the discrepancy in how this was written versus, you know, who we have on the board. And I mean, I like having the liaison specifically around climate policy being, you know, a part of it personally. If that's useful, I think it's a good way to get other, you know, board members in there and be involved, and also to just have that kind of reminder that this is a really big piece that we need to coordinate on. So I really appreciate how it's, you know, how it's currently structured, so long as that's actually useful and kind of achieving the goal. So just wanted to throw that out there.
All right, Matt, did you have, don't think we've called on you yet.
Yeah, I'll just be really brief. I don't have any questions. I just want to acknowledge that in this correspondence, there are some really meaty and substantive pieces of work that I think are really solid. I don't have questions on, but the Lieberg Canal Communication and Stakeholder Engagement Strategy is like super helpful for me to be able to see, you know, kind of what we're plotting out. And so much appreciation to the team who put that together. The same for the updated draft wildfire mitigation plan. To see that plan evolve and take shape and kind of be able to go along for the ride as staff are doing that is super helpful. So thank you for that. And then the final electrification study, both phases all put together. I hope that team is celebrating with more than one cold one after delivering all of that work. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner McCray. I'm sure they'll need more than one cold one to celebrate that. So thank you.
And nothing from me, but also I feel badly for the people whose things are included that way, because I know that they put a lot of work into those documents and we get to the end of the meeting and we don't really talk about it. So I too appreciate all of that.
So one thing, President Schlossberg, just I don't want to leave a hanging Chad, so to say. That I have to date myself because that's the old voting method. But the liaisons with the city, I would like to know from the board whether those liaisons are specific to climate or whether those are leadership liaisons. It does so that when we come back in January, that the board has had time to think about it and either reiterate that, because I believe the way it's structured right now is that these are specific for climate issues, and if the board wants to continue with that, that's how it'll come back. as opposed to leadership. So it's a little bit of board clarity around that would be helpful.
Do you want that tonight or in January?
Yeah, I'd prefer to get it tonight so that what we bring back to you in January is clear.
Well, I'll since I've got unmuted, for me, I think I would go for the leadership, because I think there's enough knowledge amongst the board right now that they can speak to the climate, and getting the relationships going between the leaders with the mayor and the council president and our president and vice president, I think is a valuable thing, and they can bring that back to us. So that's just where I would land, but I can bend with the wind.
Matt, you had your hand up. You want to weigh in?
Yeah, sure. From my experience, it does feel like it hasn't been constrained to solely climate. It does feel like there are places where there's overlap that between the work of the two policy bodies that aren't solely climate, right? When we think about water infrastructure, for example, or other major projects, there's likely to be overlap there. It does feel like part of answering your question, Frank, I think we'll be putting it back to the council and the mayor to see what they're hoping for. I'm not sure that they're thinking of it as solely climate related, but rather just kind of where the two bodies work overlaps. And I don't have a strong opinion about, whether it's just climate or a larger body of work.
John Brown, you have a comment?
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I'm wondering if
No,
John.
I would tend to go back to the leadership issue. I mean, it showed me what our last joint meeting with council, I've had quite a few of those, and that was probably the most challenging one for me to participate in. It was very challenging for me, and I think we need to figure out how we can work together better. Because if we don't, whether we're talking about water or climate or anything, it's not going to matter. If we're going to be butting heads and one entity is going to say, well, this is a policy and you fund it, and the other entity says, no, this isn't going to happen. I think we have to figure out how we get to yes rather than this is yours and this is yours. I think we have to figure out how to work together. So I would lead towards leadership.
I also think it should be more towards leadership, and I'm wondering if at any point that we could have a conversation at a board meeting on this board, just kind of coming up with our ideas as a board, what we want to work with the city on, and then those liaisons kind of take it to the city. I think that could be really helpful, and maybe it is just climate, but it could also be climate and other things that we've talked about, or things that we've I don't know, just ideas that have come up about things that we do with the city or things that we'd want to do. So I don't want to hem us in too narrowly. And I would also like to include the rest of the board in what it is that we're talking about. So maybe formalize this position a little bit more with our own kind of agenda and a report back.
That was helpful. Yeah, that was perfect. I think I got what I needed. I think we do have a number of areas we overlap with the city. Climate obviously is one, resiliency is another, emergency preparedness, joint projects, street repairs. I mean, there's all kinds of things. Financially, there are opportunities, and some of those were mentioned earlier when Jason was talking about how we partner with the city on different funding opportunities. So I think that I have enough to restructure that for January. Thank you. And as far as board agendas go, You have the board agenda report. There's a lot that's going to be teed up. I hate to put the board back to work again. It seems like there's something weird with COVID time, because it just seems like we were talking about 2020 goals yesterday, but we're now talking about 2022 goals. And so if you have any comments on the board agendas, by all means, we can adjust and take your feedback, but I don't have anything specific to call out on those.
All right, thank you. All right, then we're on our very last board wrap up. Anybody have anything to wrap up?
John Brown does.
Great.
If I may, now I'm jumping the queue in front of everybody. So two things. Number one, Frank, you just said put the board back to work again. That implies that we've not been working or doing, but I just want to know what I missed. So we'll talk about that later. But more importantly, I would like to thank Mindy for her leadership role for the last year. You've done an exemplary job. I've been through a ton of presidents, and nobody's done it better than you. I mean, thank you very much for doing what you've done, because I know it's a thankless task, and it's hurting cats, and you always eat last. That's the way it is. But thank you very much, and I wish you a happy winter holiday and things such as that. So thank you, and that's all I have.
Thank you very much, John. John Borofsky.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll echo that about Mindy's leadership. It's been a pleasure working with you as president this year. I just wanted to thank staff. You know, this is the last time I get to say that I'm a rookie. I've been here. This will be the end of the first year. It was very enjoyable. I've learned a ton of things over this year. And that's thanks to the staff working with me and doing all the onboarding and helping me drink out of that fire hose. So I really want to give shout outs to all the departments that have helped us on board: water, electricity, power generation, learning about reservoirs. All of these things were things that this little noodle boiler didn't know about a year ago. And I'm learning more. I know there's a lot more to learn, but I really appreciate all that you have. And it's going to be sad for me not to be able to pull the I'm the new guy card next year. So thank you again to all the staff.
Great. Anyone else? Go ahead, Sonia. I see you wanting to raise your hand again.
Mindy, I do really appreciate everything that you did this year. Just, it's a challenging format to work in, and something that, kind of had to jump into, and just really appreciate you doing that. And I also want to give the shout out to Commissioner Borofsky and McCrae, because, it has been new, and you guys have done a remarkable job getting up to speed and being really valuable contributors. I've just really loved working with you, and Brown, it's always a pleasure working with you. No, it's been wonderful. So thank you all. I really appreciate that we have such a cordial board, that we can respectfully, hash out ideas, and, staff that bring us, substantive things to work through. It's just really a pleasure serving on this board. So thank you, everyone, for all the hard work, for all the number of years that we've had to deal with really extenuating circumstances. So thank you.
Matt, any wrap up from you? Nope. Great.
Just one quick thing, Commissioner Schlossberg. Thanks for your leadership. I know we didn't always make it easy on you this year. There were a few things, few wrenches we threw into the wheels on you, but not just because Commissioner Brown made a comment, but I did want to thank the board for really what I think was a very productive year under some pretty extraordinary circumstances, and appreciate your leadership and direction and guidance. I feel pretty lucky that I get to work with a board that works hard to understand the issues. You provide really good guidance. You're respectful to each other and to staff, and that makes a huge difference. And so thank you for all the hard work and the contributions that you've made to the utility. I think you represent the public very well. And that's it's a privilege for me to work with you. So on behalf of staff, thank you. And then also I'd like to thank staff too, because they, I think that they really do an incredible job on working on some really complex issues, and none of these are easy issues. And because if they were easy, I think anybody could do them. And I think we have a really good staff, and I'm proud to work with them. So thank you.
Well, I want to thank you all for the opportunity of being the president this year. I've really, really enjoyed it, actually. And if you only knew how nervous I was at the beginning of the year when I took on this role and had to lead the meetings. But anyway, I'm really appreciative of being on such a smart, engaged, and respectful board, and working with you, Frank, and the other staff as well. So thank you to everybody. And I hope everybody has a good winter holiday and a happy and healthy new year. And hopefully 2022 will bring us better things. Yeah, fingers crossed. And with that, our meeting is adjourned. All right. Good night, everybody.